Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now we begin the Story 1. What medieval peasants did when lightning struck their village. It begins, as so many medieval stories do, with the weather. In the damp summer of 1284, in a low-lying village in the Shire of Wiltshire, England, the clouds had grown heavy and strange. There were no forecasts, no barometers, but the peasants knew what was coming. The stillness of the air, the smell of mud rising from already soggy fields, and the way the cattle shifted uneasily in their stalls all suggested something unnatural was approaching. And it did suddenly, violently, and with a brightness few had ever seen. Lightning struck the wooden bell tower of the parish church. Sparks leapt down the thatched roof of the nave like mice in panic, igniting dry straw that had waited years for its moment. In minutes, the building that had anchored their religious and social life was alight. People ran. Some screamed. Some knelt. Some simply stared. But what came after the responses, the rituals, the slow reordering of a community shocked into stillness, is the true heart of our story. The theology of thunder. In the 13th century, lightning was not merely a meteorological event. It was judgment. Scripture and sermons routinely framed thunder and fire from the heavens as divine communication, and not a positive one. Clerics often cited Job 36:32. He covers his hands with the lightning and commands it to strike the mark. To the village priest, if he survived the blaze, it would not be the fire that was mysterious, but its meaning. Who had sinned? What had been neglected? Was it the unmarried couple who lived too close, too comfortably? The boy who refused confession? The manor lord who withheld tithes? In the days that followed, surviving villagers would gather in hushed clusters. They would whisper and remember recent arguments, small betrayals, half-confessed envies. Every cough, every crack of wood in the night became suspect. The need to make sense of the strike was overpowering. Theologically, there were few accidents, and this was no accident. First responses, buckets and bells. The immediate response to a lightning fire was buckets, of course. But in a time before organized fire brigades or fireproof materials, the battle was largely symbolic. Women, children, and older men formed hurried chains to pass water from the village well. Stronger men tried to pull apart burning timber to create a fire break. This was dangerous and often futile. What is less often remembered is the use of church bells during storms. Peasants believed that ringing the bell would break thunder in the sky. The practice, called tempest ringing, was widespread across Western Europe until many bell ringers were electrocuted during storms, leading to its eventual banning by some churches in the 15th century. In our Wiltshire village, a young boy named Alfred had been ordered up into the bell tower just before the lightning hit. He never came down. His mother, witnesses claimed, wept silently but did not speak for 3 days. The ashes left behind. Once the fire was out, the damage became part of the landscape. The church, even partially ruined, remained sacred. But now it was also dangerous. Collapsed beams might hide spirits, it was thought. The smell of burnt incense mixed with charred oak and made even devout villagers hesitate to step inside. One widow reported that the walls of her cottage, just across from the churchyard, wept black streaks during the next rain. She refused to enter for a month, fearing the witch rain would soak her soul. In these days, people turned to charms and folk protections. It was common to hang a piece of blackened wood near the hearth wood from the burned church to keep fire spirits away. This paradoxical logic, using the burn to prevent burning, persisted in folk medicine and house rituals for centuries. Authority and blame. Lightning exposed more than thatch and timber. It often exposed the fragile relationships between village, manor, and church. The manor lord, responsible in theory for protecting the village, was often absent. In our case, Lord Baldwin de Harcourt was hunting in Normandy. He returned a fortnight later, bearing gifts for the bishop, but faced a village that had already made other arrangements. The local reeve, a sort of peasant sheriff, had organized cleanup and temporary shelters. A group of women had begun collecting herbs and oils for burns. The monks from a priory 10 miles away had walked to assist, their feet blistered by the journey. What did this mean for authority? Quietly, it meant something profound. In the face of divine wrath, people turned first not to lords but to each other. Rebuilding with fear and straw. The villagers debated rebuilding the church in stone, but stone was expensive and stonecutters were few. Instead, they patched with salvaged timber and wove a new thatch roof. The replacement bell was smaller. Still, every thunderstorm brought terror. Some villagers began marking their doorways with chalk crosses. Others whispered of moving the church to higher ground. One man insisted that the lightning had been summoned by a widow who kept a pagan charm in her apron. He left the village soon after, of his own accord. The community was changing. Faith was not disappearing but shifting, from dogma to precaution, from liturgy to lore. The ghost in the tower. Years later, the new generation knew the story as legend. Children were told that if they disrespected the priest, they would be struck like Alfric. Some swore they heard bells ringing on stormy nights, even though the bell had been taken down during repairs. The ghost in the tower became a figure of caution, less a spirit, more a memory of vulnerability. Curiously, this myth kept people away from the tower during storms, which, in hindsight, may have saved lives. Unresolved thought. What does it mean, truly, when nature intrudes upon the sacred? When something as ordinary as weather rewrites the spiritual map of a village? For the peasants of Wiltshire, the fire from the sky left more than ashes. It left a tension between faith and fear, between the seen and the sensed. But what happened in the days and weeks that followed? How did the villagers begin to interpret the strike, not just as punishment, but perhaps as a warning or an opportunity? A village seeking answers. In the aftermath of the strike, the villagers of Wiltshire were not just rebuilding their church, they were rebuilding their understanding of the world. As the days stretched into weeks, and the acrid smell of burned thatch finally faded from the air, deeper questions settled in the minds of the people. Why here, why now? Who had caused this? The villagers did not think in terms of probability or physics. They lived in a worldview shaped by divine intention, layered with local superstition, and enforced by the slow-moving but ever-present weight of the church and manor. In this liminal space between destruction and recovery, meaning was not just sought, it was assigned. Sin and superstition, the blame game begins. Lightning, though natural, was rarely seen as random. It had to have a target, and that target must have deserved it. So the villagers turned inward, and suspicion began to grow. The widow Alice, a reclusive woman in her 60s, had lived at the edge of the village near the marsh. She kept cats. She was known to mutter while walking, and she once refused to kneel during a sermon. That was enough. Some began whispering that Alice had invited the lightning, that she had made a pact, that her black cat, Old Tib, had been seen on the roof of the church days before the fire. There were no formal witch trials in England at this time, those would come much later, in the 16th and 17th centuries, but accusations of maleficium, evil-doing, had long been part of folk justice, and they didn't need a court to act. A group of young men, emboldened by beer and fear, confronted Alice one morning. They didn't hurt her, not physically, but they demanded she leave, take her cat, and seek shelter in the woods beyond the mill stream. Her cottage was burned 3 days later. No one claimed responsibility. The village felt safer. And yet the weather did not change. The church responds slowly. It took 6 weeks before a bishop's envoy arrived to inspect the ruins and offer judgment. The envoy was not a priest, but a canon named Brother Gilbert, trained in theology and well-versed in the legal codes of the church. He arrived on a sturdy mare, wore a black cloak despite the heat, and asked more questions than he answered. Brother Gilbert took careful note of the damage. He spoke with survivors. He made a show of praying beside the scorched altar, and then he gave his verdict. The lightning, he declared, was indeed a sign from God, but not of condemnation. Rather, it was a divine testing, a moment of trial through which faith might be refined. He cited the book of Zechariah and the trials of Job. But in private, he said something different to the reeve, who recorded it later. Tell them to pray more and to drink less ale, and for God's sake, stop ringing the bell during storms. The church would assist with rebuilding, Gilbert promised. Funds would come from the bishopric eventually. But in the meantime, he left behind something else, a young priest named Father Oswin, freshly ordained, to guide the village back to piety. Father Oswin was 22, pale and terrified of storms. A priest without authority. Oswin tried to assert himself, but few listened. The previous priest had been old, gruff, and local. He had known everyone's grandfather and mediated every land dispute. Oswin was from York and spoke with a northern accent that made him sound like a foreigner. Worse, he didn't know the local customs. He denounced the use of burnt wood as protective charms. He demanded confession every Saturday. He condemned the maypole dance as pagan. The villagers complied partly, but quietly they mocked him. But something unexpected happened. As Oswin fumbled his way through sermons and mispronounced local names, some began to feel protective of him. He became not a figure of judgment, but of shared awkwardness. He made mistakes, but he stayed. He helped thatch roofs. He blessed fields. He listened. And slowly, Oswin began to change too. He learned to nod along when peasants spoke of ghosts. He stopped trying to suppress all superstition and instead reinterpreted it. When a child fell sick, he brought both prayers and elderflower. When the wind howled at night, he advised villagers to place crosses on their doors but didn't mind if they also used rosemary and salt. In this compromise, a kind of peace emerged. The manor lord's return and the politics of penance. Lord Baldwin de Harcourt returned from France after nearly 2 months. He had heard of the lightning strike and brought with him a donation, a carved crucifix, ornate and imported, for the new altar. But his arrival was met with tension. In his absence, the village had functioned without him. The reeve had taken on more duties, and villagers had repaired damage on communal land without manorial permission. Worse, Baldwin had failed to provide immediate aid, something expected under the traditional feudal compact, in which lords were protectors as much as rulers. To reassert his authority, Baldwin convened a court baron session, where fines were issued for unauthorized gathering of wood, construction on manorial land, and failure to report a fire to the manor. The villagers paid, but they did not forget. Baldwin's authority, though intact on paper, was weakened in practice. A quiet rebellion had already occurred, not with weapons, but with buckets, song, and shared bread. Folk memory and collective healing. As summer turned to autumn, the story of the lightning strike began to change. Children now told it as a tale of survival. They spoke of how their mothers had saved the hens, how their fathers had rebuilt the granary wall in a single afternoon. The burning of the church became part of village identity, not just a tragedy, but a shared memory. They even composed a simple chant, half rhyme, half prayer. Fire in the tower, rain in the cup. Let no sinner lift it up. If thunder roars, the bells stay still, lest heaven find a soul to kill. Folk rituals emerged. A drop of ale was now poured into the earth before drinking during storms, an offering to appease the skis. Bobbies born during thunderstorms were said to carry a light mark, a birthmark touched by lightning, and were believed to be both blessed and cursed. One child, named Edric, born the night of a terrible storm a year later, became known as Stormborn. His parents insisted the midwife saw a flash of light in the room before he cried. These stories, whether true or not, served a purpose. They gave meaning to randomness. They gave structure to fear. And they allowed a community to reweave its fabric, one thread at a time. Practical changes that lasted. Not all consequences were spiritual or symbolic. Structural changes occurred in response to the strike. Roofs were rebuilt with a mix of straw and damp clay, less flammable than the dry thatch used before. Bell towers were kept lower and often isolated from the main building, if rebuilt at all. A thunderstone, a large flat rock placed in the village center, was used as a grounding point. No one fully understood why it worked, but they believed it absorbed sky fire. Some villagers began storing tools and valuables in clay pots buried underground, believing metal attracted lightning. Whether these practices were effective didn't matter as much as the belief in them. They gave villagers agency, something rare in a world ruled by distant kings, absent lords, and capricious weather. The role of women in quiet survival. In most official histories, the events surrounding disasters like fires are told through the actions of men, reeves, lords, clergy. But in Wiltshire, as in most villages, women were the true first responders. They organized water chains, they tended burns, they salvaged linens, they cooked for displaced families, they knew which herbs eased pain and which poultices reduced fever. It was also the midwives and wise women who interpreted dreams, who soothed frightened children, and who maintained rituals of protection. Though unnamed in records, these women were essential, and their knowledge, passed from mother to daughter, would outlast the written accounts. Unresolved thought. So much of medieval life was shaped by what could not be explained. When lightning struck the heart of a village, it did more than destroy it, revealed the invisible structures of belief, of resilience, and of quiet power. But what happens when the memory of that fire begins to fade? How do communities preserve the lessons of calamity as time smooths over the scars? When scars become stone. A year had passed since the fire from the sky changed the village. The church had been patched, not rebuilt fully in stone, as some had dreamed, but stabilized enough to hold mass again. The tower remained a blackened stump, covered now with a crude wooden cross. The bell had not been replaced. In fact, no one wanted it back. The air of solemnity it once inspired had been replaced by unease. People still crossed themselves when passing the ruin, and children dared one another to touch the charred beam by the west wall. But something subtle had shifted. The scar on the village was no longer just physical. It had settled into the rhythm of daily life. A calendar marked by thunder. The event had occurred in early July, harvest not yet begun, but the grain tall and gold. That week had become known simply as the burning week. From then on, each July, the village held a quiet fast, abstaining from ale and meat on the day of the fire. It was not an official church holiday. It wasn't even mentioned in Mass, but families remembered. On that day, people wore their older tunics, left tools untouched, and some even walked barefoot as a gesture of humility. Not all participated, but enough did to give the week a gravity not found on the official calendar. This small observance, born of fear and reflection, planted a cultural seed, a sense that even peasants, poor and overlooked, could mark time in their own way. A change in the reeve. Walter, the village reeve, had become something of a leader during the crisis. But as life normalized, his role came under scrutiny. The Lord had begun to reassert his dominance, demanding traditional obedience. Yet Walter had tasted responsibility. He had kept people alive. He had chosen not to exile the crippled boy who had knocked over a water bucket in the chaos, though some had called it sabotage. He had negotiated with monks, overseen repairs, and importantly refused to blame. When the court baron demanded stricter fines that winter, Walter openly challenged the steward's decisions. He lost his post for it. But something unexpected happened. The village began calling on him anyway for disputes, for advice, for burial blessings when the priest was ill. His dismissal did not take. In time, Walter became the first unofficial village elder, a position not recognized in any charter or scroll, but one that held real authority in the hearts of the people. Small changes in sacred space. Inside the church, the altar now stood to the east, rebuilt hastily from salvaged oak. Behind it, instead of the ornate crucifix the manor lord had gifted, a simpler wooden figure of Christ had been placed, one carved by a local artisan. The gifted crucifix, imported from France and inlaid with costly stones, was stored away. Father Oswin had quietly asked that it not be displayed. He had begun to understand that symbols made by the people carried more meaning than those imposed upon them. Another small change, the addition of a single clay pot sealed and placed under the altar stone. No one spoke of it openly, but some knew it held scorched ash and soil from the day of the fire, a kind of relic, though unofficial, blending superstition and reverence. This was how folk religion was made layered, unofficial, and profoundly local. Generational lessons. Children born after the strike would never remember the smoke or the panic, but they grew up in its long shadow. Their lullabies included references to sky fire. Their games reenacted bucket lines and imagined rescues. Parents told stories of the fire as both caution and pride. "We endured," they would say. "We stayed." These children would come of age not just with a memory of the fire, but with a culture shaped by it. They learned that waiting for authority could mean ruin, that storms demanded preparation, that sometimes the priest didn't have all the answers and that was all right. They also learned that resilience could live in small things: a salvaged roof beam, a black cat returning from the woods, a priest who stuttered through his sermons but never stopped coming. Quiet disobedience. Though not openly rebellious, the village had begun to do things differently. When a traveling official from the bishopric arrived years later to assess tithes, he was surprised to find that some fields, those near the church ruins, were now communal, managed without clear ownership. They were technically part of the Lord's domain, but after the fire, families had begun planting vegetables there for the entire village. At first it was out of necessity. Later, it became custom. The official made note, but did not press the issue. He sensed something that perhaps many medieval officials understood on an instinctive level. Villages had their own quiet power. It was not written in ink, but in soil and memory. Echoes in the wider world. Was the Wiltshire fire unique? Not at all. Across medieval Europe, records mention churches struck by lightning, barns burned in storms, and small settlements that vanished due to fire. But rarely are these stories told from the ground, from the viewpoint of peasants, women, children, reeves, and priests who lived through the aftermath. More often, the records note only the damages and the donors who paid for rebuilding, how much grain was lost, which lord made a penitent donation. But if we look between the lines, we see a different history, one of small survival, of unrecorded adaptations. In some areas, lightning led to architectural change: shorter towers, stone spires, the invention of lightning rods centuries later. In others, it led to cultural shifts, as beliefs bent under the pressure of repeated catastrophe. The peasants of Wiltshire were part of this larger, quiet movement. Ordinary people reshaping belief, structure, and authority after nature reminded them of their fragility. The legacy of Alfric. No story of the fire could be told without the boy, Alfric. His death had been sudden, almost mythic: a child in the bell tower, struck down by divine fire. His mother had never spoken of him again, and over time no one dared ask. But a year later, a young girl named Winna placed a small carving at the base of the ruined tower. It was crude, a figure of a boy with a raised arm, but unmistakably meant to be him. Beneath it, she scratched the word "listen." The carving remained for years, slowly worn by wind and rain. No one removed it. Children began to say that Alfric was a kind of guardian, now not a ghost, but a watcher. When storms came, they left wildflowers or bits of bread at the carving's base, not out of fear, but remembrance. This was not canon law. It was not theology, but it was history lived and remembered in the most human way. Lessons written in ash. What do we learn from a village struck by lightning? Not just about fire or fear, but about the long echo of disaster, about how memory becomes tradition, about how authority shaken gives way to quiet strength. In the end, the fire changed little in official terms. The village remained on the same manorial rolls. The bishop's tithe was still collected. The seasons rolled on. But beneath that, a deeper change occurred. The people had learned they could organize without permission. They had seen that priests and lords could fail, and that the world would still go on. They had begun to shape their own sacred meanings from the ashes of tragedy. This is the history that rarely makes it into scrolls or chronicles, but it lives in local songs, in field boundaries, in rebuilt cottages, and in the way a bell tower was never quite replaced. Final reflection. In a world where thunder could strike a church and fire could erase the familiar, medieval villagers found ways to root themselves in meaning. Not through rebellion, not through reform, but through the slow, stubborn survival of ordinary people. They endured not just the flame, but the uncertainty that followed. And in doing so, they left behind a quiet kind of legacy. One in which even the boring, daily, uneventful moments are made sacred by memory, community, and the stories told beside the hearth. Story 2, The Day the Bread Went Sour, the grain rot crisis of 1321. Introduction, the strange smell in the village. In the late summer of 1321, something strange happened in a small village outside York. It was subtle at first, a different taste in the bread, a musty scent lingering in the air. Villagers whispered that the grain smelled off, like wet wool or moldy hay. Some children refused to eat. Others ate but grew sick. By the third week of August, the problem was undeniable. The bread was turning sour and no one knew why. This wasn't a plague. No rats, no boils, no mass graves. It was more insidious, more ordinary. But for the people of this small village, and many like it across northern England, this grain rot would mark the beginning of a long, slow unraveling of their world. This is the story of how bad grain and spoiled bread reshaped lives, relationships, and faith in the simplest of medieval communities. There were no famous battles, no royal decrees, only weather, waiting, and the dread of a harvest gone wrong. A wet year and a dangerous harvest. The year 1321 had begun like many others. Spring had been late, but not worryingly so. Lent was observed. Plowing began after Easter. The Manor Reeve reported average activity, but the rain started in June and it did not stop. The Annals of Lanarcost, a chronicle from the time, speaks vaguely of unusual rains and poor yields. But in villages without scribes or monks, the only records were in memory and complaint. Crops ripened slowly in the waterlogged fields. Barley, the lifeblood of peasant bread and ale, grew pale and thin. More dangerously, the rye, cheaper and more common, turned black in places. Strange tufts like soot or mildew grew between the husks. Many dismissed it. Grain always had imperfections. When the harvest finally came in August, it was rushed. Wet grain doesn't store well. The thrashing was done with haste. The drying kilns, fueled with damp peat and brush, smoked but didn't dry evenly. The granaries smelled wrong. But the people were hungry, and so the bread was baked anyway. Daily bread, a medieval essential. To understand the panic of the sour bread, you must understand what bread meant to a medieval peasant. Bread wasn't a side dish, it was a staple, often over half of a person's daily caloric intake. The average villager consumed coarse loaves made of rye, barley, or maslin, a mix of rye and wheat, baked in communal ovens or hearths. It was what children chewed while watching sheep. It was what old men dipped in pottage. It was soaked in ale, smeared with lard, and given as alms. Bread was life. So when bread began to sour, or worse, to make people sick, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a threat to survival. In some cases, the spoiled grain led to stomach cramps, nausea, and fever. In others, more mysteriously, people described fits or strange hallucinations. One woman swore her husband saw demons dancing by the fire after eating blackened rye. Of course, none of this was understood in scientific terms. Today, we might guess that ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, was to blame, causing poisoning, delirium, and even death. But in 1321, people had no word for ergot. They called it the devil's grain. Suspicions and signs. As sickness spread, suspicion followed. The village miller, Hugh, was among the first accused. His mill had been overloaded during the rush of harvest, and some said he let damp grain sit too long. Others blamed the baker's wife, Ellen, who had once refused to sell bread to the Reeves' cousin. She was said to mutter to herself and had an unusual scar on her hand. Superstition fed on fear. People looked for signs. A fox was seen near the oven house at dusk. A child found a piece of bread shaped like a cross and fainted after eating it. A cow gave birth to a stillborn calf with a twisted leg. The priest, an aging man named Father Benedict, struggled to calm the rising panic. He reminded the villagers that trials came to test their faith, but even he seemed uneasy. His own nephew had collapsed after a meal of rye porridge and babbled about angels with black wings. The boundary between sickness and sin grew thin. Communal tensions and quiet hoarding. The grain rot was not uniform. Some households had stored barley more carefully. Others had hidden small stashes of wheat for private use. Soon, hoarding began. Ellen, the baker's wife, began charging more for her loaves. Families accused each other of hiding grain, stealing flour, or overusing communal ovens. The manor's granary remained sealed, its contents reserved for rents and tithes, and the Lord's steward refused to release any to the villagers. By September, bread was being rationed within families. Children were sent to bed with only a heel of crust. Some villagers tried to bake flatbreads from ground acorns or dried peas. The results were tough, bitter, and hard to swallow. The social glue of shared baking and feasting began to fracture. Responses rooted in ritual. With no clear answers, the villagers turned to what they knew: ritual. Father Benedict organized special masses for the blessing of the grain. The church held vigils, long evenings of candlelight and prayer, asking for deliverance. Psalms were read aloud, especially those referencing plagues and curses upon the land. But beyond church rites, other, more local customs resurfaced. At the village cross, some women began placing small bundles of herbs: fennel, mugwort, rosemary, believed to ward off rot and disease. An old woman, Agatha, claimed that burying 3 coins under the grain heap would pull the poison down. A few farmers tried it. Even the manor steward, a practical man, sprinkled salt around the edge of the manor granary, not to bless it, he said, but to keep the rats away. No help from above. The larger structures of authority, manor, church, and crown, offered little support. The local lord, Sir Robert of Balderton, was preoccupied with his own holdings. His steward noted the situation, but grain losses were widespread, and the manorial courts were more concerned with rents than hunger. The church's higher offices were distant. The Archbishop of York issued general prayers, but no food. And King Edward II, whose court was embroiled in political disputes and rebellions, never heard of the sour bread in the tiny village near York. As always, the peasants were left to manage themselves. A story half remembered. There is no chronicle of this event, no parchment bearing its name. And yet, In the oral histories that would be passed down quietly around hearths and during winter evenings, the year 1321 would be remembered not for war or plague, but for the year the bread went bad. Old women would speak of it with a shudder. Mothers would warn children not to eat anything with black spots. Bakers learned to smell flour more carefully, and every wet summer after, villagers would glance toward the granary and wonder, what if it happens again? Unresolved thought. Bread is simple, it is humble, but when it goes wrong, it takes the whole world with it slowly, silently, and without warning. But how did the villagers survive the coming winter? What did they do when the poisoned grain ran out and the hunger truly began? The grain runs out. By the end of October, the last of the grain had been consumed. Not all at once. A few households held onto hidden stores, but the majority of villagers had long since scraped their bins clean. Bread, once coarse but comforting, had become a distant memory. Now meals were a thin pottage made from wild herbs, beans, and roots. Salt was reserved for the sick. Ale, brewed from poor grain and weak malt, had become watery and sour. The people were not starving yet, but the signs were there. Children with swollen bellies, elderly neighbors who stopped rising from their straw beds. A pregnant woman miscarried in the cold of November, and some said it was the hunger that did it. But the deeper threat wasn't just physical. It was the slow erosion of hope, the sense that winter would be long and help would not come. Foraging and the forest. The people of the village turned to the land. Even though most forests were technically the domain of the Lord, the villagers knew where the old footpaths wound between the trees. In late autumn, mushrooms, nuts, and a few bitter berries could be found. Hazelnuts were boiled and mashed into a kind of paste. Chestnuts, when found, were roasted and pounded into a rough flour. Some ventured further. Men and older boys set traps for rabbits or birds, though poaching was illegal. One young man, Thomas the smith's apprentice, was caught by the steward with a hare in his satchel. He was fined half a year's wages, though the Lord waived the punishment after Thomas's mother begged for mercy. Still, the example had been made. Others turned to fish traps set in the stream. Eels, tench, and minnows were caught, smoked, and saved for leaner days. The village pond, once considered unclean, was dredged for frogs and snails. Hunger changes morals. What was once taboo became survival. A new kind of theft. Theft was rare in most medieval villages, not because people were more honest, but because everyone knew each other. To steal from a neighbor was not just a crime, it was a betrayal of the only community you had. But that winter, theft crept in. It began with small things: a missing turnip, a broken lock on the drying shed, a chicken gone from its pen. Most villagers said nothing. They suspected but did not accuse. To confront someone meant tension, and tension meant danger. But when the manor's small granary was breached in December, a hole cut in the back wall, and a sack of barley taken, the steward could not ignore it. He summoned the villagers and demanded confession. No one spoke. 2 boys were beaten, then released. The grain was never recovered. After that, the manor placed a guard outside the granary at night. A boy of 14, paid in bread. Faith under strain. The church remained open through the winter, but Father Benedict had changed. He was thinner now, his beard streaked with gray. He had not bathed in weeks. He spoke more softly and sometimes not at all. During Advent, he fasted not from choice, but from necessity. The altar candles burned low, replacements were too expensive. The priest's voice cracked during Mass, and once he fainted while giving the Eucharist. He began preaching about Job, the man tested by God. He read from Lamentations, "He has broken my teeth with gravel." And once, when a child cried during a sermon, Benedict stopped mid-sentence and sat in silence for the rest of the service. Still, people came. They sat on cold benches and listened, not for comfort but for structure. The church gave them rhythm, even if it could no longer give them food. Small kindnesses. Despite hardship, small kindnesses began to stitch the village together again. A widow shared her last onion with her neighbor. The baker's wife, Ellen, once suspected of witchcraft, now gave bread crusts to the priest each Sunday. A boy found a dead squirrel in the woods and gave it to the smith's family, whose infant daughter was too weak to cry. The reeve, though stripped of official status after criticizing the manor, organized a rotation to watch over the weakest villagers. Those too old or ill to fetch water or wood were quietly tended to. No one spoke of charity. It was simply what had to be done. A rumor of aid. In January, a rumor began to spread. Food relief was coming. Someone claimed to have overheard a monk from York say that the church would be sending wagons of grain to afflicted villages. Others said that the crown, pressured by rebellious barons, had promised aid to loyal manors. Father Benedict cautiously repeated the rumor during Mass, urging patience and prayer. The steward sent a rider to the nearest abbey to inquire. People waited. Nothing came. Weeks passed, the rumor faded. But something strange had happened. For a time, the village had believed, and that belief had warmed them even briefly. Dreams and night fears. By February, hunger had entered the mind. People dreamed of food. Children spoke of seeing loaves of bread floating in the sky. One man claimed to hear singing in the fields at night. The sick often muttered in their sleep. The reeve's wife described a vision of a field of golden rye, untouched by rain, stretching beyond the church. Was it hunger, delirium, or something else? In these dreams, people found strange comfort. One young girl said she dreamed of her grandmother who told her, "Spring is waiting behind the hill." She held onto that sentence for weeks. In the absence of food, hope became the meal. A death that changed things. In late February, Father Benedict died. He passed quietly in his sleep, wrapped in a woolen blanket in the tiny room behind the church. He had eaten almost nothing in the last week. His face was peaceful. The village buried him with what dignity they could muster. A wooden cross, a few wildflowers, and a procession that moved slowly through the frost. His death struck hard not because he had been powerful, but because he had been present. A constant, even when the world grew uncertain. After his burial, something changed. The villagers stopped waiting for help. They began to plan. A meeting without permission. In early March, the reeve called a gathering not in the manor court, but in the old barn by the field's edge. He asked for volunteers to travel to the market town of Thirsk, 2 days' walk away, to see if food could be purchased, traded, or begged. A few men stepped forward. 2 women insisted on joining, offering woolen goods to barter. Together they gathered the little they had: dyed cloth, eggs, beeswax, a carved spindle, and sent the group off. It was a quiet act of defiance. No lord had given permission. No priest had blessed the journey, but it was the village deciding for itself. The first signs of thaw. By mid-March, the snows had begun to melt. Birds returned. The stream ran stronger. The first green shoots of wild garlic appeared on the forest floor. The travelers returned with news. Thirsk had food, limited and expensive, but food nonetheless. They brought a sack of oats, some dried beans, and promises that more might be available after Easter. The village cheered, not loudly but with quiet relief. Even before the first good loaves returned, people began to plant again. Soil was tilled with aching hands. Old seed was found, some of it half-rot. Still, they planted. Because they had decided to go on. Unresolved thought. They had survived not by miracle, not by decree, but by each other. By making small decisions in the dark, by sharing crusts and carrying the weak, by planning when no help came. But what would happen when the next harvest came? Would the memory of sour bread change how they lived, or would it fade with the spring rains? A different kind of spring. By April, the village had changed. It had not grown wealthier. The people were still thin. Hunger still curled in the corners of daily life, but a resilience had taken root. The ground was softening. The air, once sharp with cold, carried the scent of damp soil and sheep dung. The first wild greens, nettle, sorrel, garlic sprouted near the stream. These were gathered quickly, chopped into broth, and ladled into wooden bowls with reverence. The people had survived, but more importantly, they had learned. Bread returns. The first loaf of the year was baked by Ellen, the baker's wife. It was barley with a little oat to stretch it, coarse, dark, hard-edged but sweet with the absence of rot. She placed it in the center of the oven house, not for sale but as an offering. Each family took a piece. Even the steward accepted a small slice and said nothing about taxes or rights. Later that week, new loaves began to appear, some shared, some bartered, some saved for the feast of Easter. The bread was uneven and humble, but it was safe. The sour loaves of the previous year were burned in a ceremonial fire. No one said any words, but as the smoke rose, several villagers crossed themselves. It was not superstition, it was memory. A new relationship with grain. The villagers never forgot what happened. Though they lacked the language of fungi or the science of ergot, they became more careful. They began to inspect rye more closely, discarding any kernels that were too dark or misshapen. They turned back to barley when they could, even though it was rougher and less filling. They changed their drying methods, digging small trenches near the kilns to help with airflow. They began to store smaller quantities of flour in sealed pots, rather than letting it sit in piles in the loft. Some of these ideas came from passing travelers. A shepherd from Lincolnshire had told the smith's son that his village now dried grain in woven baskets above the hearth smoke. A nun passing through had suggested adding crushed mustard seed to deter spoilage. No one claimed these methods were perfect, but they were adaptations, small shifts in knowledge passed from hand to hand, field to field. A quiet shift in power. The steward remained in place, as did the manor system, but something had shifted that winter. During the worst weeks of hunger, the villagers had acted without waiting for permission. They had journeyed to Thirsk, bartered cloth and beeswax, formed watch rotations, and shared resources. The steward had watched, powerless to stop them. Now, even with the fields under the Lord's legal control, the people began claiming more ownership over their time and labor. They coordinated sowing schedules together rather than waiting for instructions. They worked in teams of their choosing. They formed informal agreements to swap tools, trade tasks, and store surplus communally. None of this was written down, but it worked. The feudal structure remained intact on paper, but in practice, the village was more self-governing than ever before. The memory of Benedict. Father Benedict's death had left a void. For weeks, no priest arrived to replace him. The church, preoccupied with broader regional issues, had no urgency about sending clergy to a poor village. But the people did not stop worshiping. Ellen the baker opened the church doors each Sunday. The reeve read aloud from a torn book of psalms. Songs were sung, candles lit, prayers whispered. The services became simpler but more intimate. No Latin, no incense, no rigid sermons, just scripture and silence. Eventually, a traveling friar stopped in the village. He offered to stay, but the people were wary. They told him, "We already have our church." He stayed for 2 weeks, then left, blessing them as he walked the road toward Ripon. A feast of ordinary things. When the harvest of 1322 came, it was better. Still thin, still affected by damp but not spoiled. Bread returned fully to the table. To mark the turning of fortune, the village held a feast. Not a grand banquet, there was no lord in attendance, no banners or minstrels. Just tables placed end to end down the main path, and every household contributing what they could. Fresh bread, smoked fish, dried peas, onions, eggs, and a single roasted goose. It wasn't about abundance. It was about presence. everyone was there. They told stories, they sang. Children reenacted the journey to Thirsk with wooden carts. Ellen was asked to speak a few words. She declined but smiled, a rare thing. And when the sun set, they lit small fires and talked late into the night. Lessons spoken and unspoken. From that time on, the story of the sour bread became part of the village's unwritten history. Young boys were warned not to handle rye without inspecting it. Girls were taught how to dry herbs that softened the belly. Travelers were asked where their grain came from and how it was stored. No formal schools existed, but the lessons endured through ritual and repetition. Bread was now broken before being eaten, a quiet check for rot. New grain was mixed with old in small amounts to test it. The oven house was cleaned ritually every Michaelmas. These weren't rules, they were habits of survival. A changed identity. Something else changed too, how the village saw itself. Before the crisis, they had been poor, isolated, and mostly invisible. Now they thought of themselves as survivors capable of organizing, resisting, and adapting. They took pride in this. The phrase, "we didn't wait for York," became shorthand for doing things themselves. It was said with a chuckle, but carried weight. Even neighboring villages noticed. People asked how they had endured the rot. The Reeves spoke to others at local markets. A few even sent young men to learn how to build the improved grain drying trenches. In this way, the legacy of the crisis spread not as tragedy, but as a model of peasant adaptation. The next generation. Years passed, children grew, a few families moved away, others arrived. The memory of the sour bread was passed down like folklore. It joined the oral canon of other village trials. The year of the frost, the year the sheep vanished, the year the priest vanished. But unlike many tales, this one had a resolution, a beginning, middle, and end. Suffering, yes, but also endurance, community, and a subtle victory. The loaves were whole again, the ovens warm, but the memory of that rot stayed tucked in the corners of every storeroom. And the people never took bread for granted again. Final reflection. History remembers kings and plagues, castles and treaties, but it is also shaped quietly, powerfully by bad harvests, wet grain, and the villagers who refused to give up. The story of the grain rot of 1321 is not grand, but it is profound. It reminds us that resilience is rarely dramatic. It is in small hands kneading dough, in silent sacrifices, in communal decisions made in barns and by firelight. And perhaps most importantly, it shows that survival is not only about enduring hunger but learning from it and teaching the next to do better. Story 3. How a village survived a season of bad omens. It began with a cat. In the autumn of 1308, in a wooded hamlet near the border of Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire, an ordinary black cat climbed onto the roof of the village bakehouse and refused to come down. It stayed there for 3 days unmoving, staring silently at anyone who passed. The baker, a cautious man named Ralph, threw stones and shouted, but the cat did not budge. Children came to look. Elders muttered prayers. A few women crossed themselves. By the 3rd day, when the cat still hadn't moved, people began to whisper, "This is not just a cat." And then the omens began. The omens multiply. Within the same week, 3 things happened. A newborn calf was found dead, with twisted legs. The village well turned cloudy for 2 days, then cleared without explanation. A flock of geese flew overhead in the wrong season, migrating far too early, and in the wrong direction. Individually, these were not unusual events. Calves sometimes die, wells cloud from runoff, geese occasionally behave oddly, but together and following the appearance of the unmoving black cat, they formed a pattern. The villagers, deeply embedded in folk belief, did not wait for priests or lords to explain. They interpreted the signs themselves. Someone had brought misfortune into the village. Someone had angered the old spirits. Or worse, someone had invited them. The village and its suspicions. This was a small village, fewer than 60 souls. Most lived in wooden cottages with daubed walls and straw roofs. They tended sheep, grew barley, and fished in the nearby stream. Their world was tight, familiar, and always watching itself. So when suspicion crept in, it had few places to hide. The first glances fell on Edith, an older woman who lived alone at the edge of the fields. Her husband had died of a wasting illness. Her son had vanished on the road to Newark. She spoke little. She kept cats. It was not long before people began referring to Edith's cat, though no one could say for certain if the cat on the roof was hers. Children were told not to visit her. One boy claimed she had witch eyes, though he could not explain what that meant. The fire of suspicion needed little fuel, and autumn winds blew steadily. The priest who wasn't there. Under different circumstances, the village might have turned to the church for clarity, but their priest, Father Ulrich, had been called away to attend the bishop's court in Lincoln, and no one knew when he would return. In his absence, the village was guided by the alderman, a middle-aged weaver named John. He was respected, if not beloved. He believed in order and was deeply uncomfortable with the rising talk of omens. John urged calm. He reminded villagers that cats were common, that wells were sensitive to rain, that geese were geese. But calm does not comfort when fear has found form, especially when that form walks on 4 paws and stares down from rooftops. The rituals begin. By early October, quiet protective rituals began appearing across the village. Crosses of straw tied and hung over doors. Garlic braided and nailed to beams. Pins driven into cottage thresholds, tips facing outward. These were not church-sanctioned acts. They were remnants of older beliefs, passed down through grandmothers and whispered over cauldrons. They were not spells, exactly, but they weren't prayers either. The cat, still seen often on the bakehouse, on the church roof, in the tree near the stream, became a living omen. It never meowed. It never approached. Some said its eyes glowed at night. Others claimed it vanished into thin air. A few admitted in hushed tones that they had begun to dream of it. And always, suspicion pointed back to Edith. Edith speaks. One afternoon, Edith came to the village green. This alone was unusual. She rarely left her cottage. But on this day, she stood beside the bakehouse and said calmly to a gathering crowd, "I do not own that cat, but I have known its kind before." She said it had been drawn here by unrest, by imbalance. That someone had done wrong and the land had noticed. She did not accuse. She did not explain further. She only said, "If you wanted to leave, you must put your own house in order." Then she returned to her home. The villagers stood in silence. Her words were strange, but what disturbed them most was that they made a kind of sense. A reawakening of fear. Her words did not calm the village. They sharpened its fear. If the cat had come because of imbalance, what imbalance? Who had done wrong? Why was this happening now? Suddenly, every minor quarrel felt weighted. The cobbler's apprentice, who had been caught stealing eggs. The young couple living together without being married. The shepherd who neglected Sunday Mass. Even the alderman who had taken timber from the forest without permission. People began to confess, not to the priest, he was still gone, but to each other. Quietly, shamefully, apologies were made, arguments were smoothed over, alms were given to the poor. It was not repentance in the religious sense, it was communal atonement. And yet the cat remained. The return of the priest. In the second week of October, Father Ulrich returned. He was tired, thin, and rode a lame mule. When told of the cat and the omens, he reacted with mild irritation. "Cats are God's creatures," he said. "So are storms, so is mildew." But when he saw the pins in the door frames and the straw crosses in the rafters, he grew concerned. These were signs of folk religion, often condemned by church doctrine. He preached a sermon the following Sunday denouncing superstition, witch marking, and idle charms. He reminded his flock that only faith in God could ward off misfortune. But the cat came to the churchyard during the sermon, sat beside the grave of a child, and watched. Ulrich stopped mid-sentence when he noticed. No one moved. After that, he did not mention the cat again. A strange peace. Then suddenly, things began to return to normal. The village well remained clear. The cattle remained healthy. No strange birds were seen. The cat disappeared. Just as suddenly as it had come, the wave of fear passed. Some believed the prayers had worked. Others thought Edith's warning had been heeded. A few whispered that the cat had taken the misfortune with it. Edith resumed her quiet life. The charms were removed from doorways. Father Ulrich carried on with sermons. The alderman declared the matter resolved. But under the surface, something had changed. Unresolved thought. When the cat left, it took with it more than fear. It carried away something invisible yet powerful. The recognition that belief is fragile, flexible, and easily stirred by the quiet symbols of daily life. But what happened to Edith, who had never denied the whispers and never apologized? And what did the villagers truly believe about what had happened when no one was watching? The watcher in the woods. After the cat disappeared, the village calmed, at least on the surface. But for weeks, some villagers claimed they saw shadows moving in the woods. Nothing clearly supernatural, just movement, a flash of black fur, a shape in the trees. Some children refused to go near the forest paths, saying they heard purring or worse, whispering. These sightings gradually faded, but not the feeling. Something had shifted, something too delicate to name. They no longer spoke openly of the cat. It had become a kind of silence shared between them, a story so unsettling that only its edges could be acknowledged. And at the center of this quiet stood Edith. Edith's cottage. Edith lived in a wattle-and daub cottage near the old Roman road, by a stretch of forest that had long since gone to thicket. Her home was tidy, though small, an herb garden out front, a smoke hole patched with slate, and 3 cats of varying colors lounging beneath a bench. Villagers avoided it. Children crossed the road when walking past. Some men muttered about driving her out, but no one followed through. Why? Because Edith was useful. She knew how to cure burns with goose fat and elder bark. She treated coughs with horehound and mint. She could deliver bobbies when the midwife was away, and set broken fingers better than the steward's own physician. She also asked for little, bread when available, help mending her fence, a few sprigs of fresh rosemary. And so she was feared but kept. The visiting monk. In early November, a traveling Benedictine monk arrived in the village, seeking shelter on his way to Crowland Abbey. His name was Brother Ambrose, and he had a soft voice and sharp eyes. He asked no questions at first, only listened. But when he noticed the unease in the village, how people glanced at Edith's cottage, how they fell silent when animals acted strangely, he inquired. The alderman tried to explain without explaining. He mentioned a season of disturbance and unfortunate associations. He spoke of the black cat. He avoided the word witch. But Ambrose understood. He had heard similar stories elsewhere, tales of wise women, old cats, bad bread, and storms taken as signs. That night he asked to visit Edith. A conversation by candlelight. We do not know what was said during that meeting. There were no witnesses. But the monk stayed with Edith for over an hour. He left pale and quiet. The next morning, he told the alderman he would be moving on. But before leaving, he offered a strange warning. She is no danger to you, but if you insist on fearing her, you will give her power she does not want to hold. The monk departed before midday. No one ever saw him again. Whispers in winter. As winter set in, so did the whispers. Though the cat had vanished, the villagers continued to watch Edith. They noticed when smoke didn't rise from her chimney. They speculated about her visitors. They wondered what she had said to the monk. A rumor began that Edith had sent the cat, or worse become it. Some said they heard cats yowling at night. Others believed they saw paw prints in the frost, larger than they should have been, circling their homes. Still, no formal accusations were made. And this is key. There were no trials, no torches, no burnings. Because even amid the fear, the village was caught in a web of contradictions. They suspected Edith, but they needed her. They feared what she represented, but they didn't want her gone. The girl who fell ill. In January, a girl named Betta, age 7, fell ill. Her mother said she had eaten snow from the roof and taken ill with chills. Others said she had been playing near Edith's garden. A few went further, claiming Betta had mocked one of the cats, chasing it with a stick. She developed a fever, then rashes, then fits. She muttered nonsense and thrashed in her straw bed. The village panicked. Her father went to Father Ulrich. The priest came and anointed her, but could do nothing more. They called for the steward's physician, who refused to travel in winter. As a last resort, they turned reluctantly to Edith. A cure or a coincidence? Edith came uninvited to Betta's home. She brought a bundle of herbs wrapped in linen, yarrow, willow bark, feverfew. She asked for hot water, honey, and silence. She stayed the night. By morning, Betta's fever had broken. She slept peacefully, breathing evenly. Her rash had faded. The village was stunned. Some called it healing. Others said it was proof that Edith had caused the sickness only to lift it. Both views confirmed her power in opposite ways. Edith said nothing. She returned to her home, declined all payment, and asked only that the girl's shoes be left by her doorstep for a day. No one knew why. But the shoes were delivered. Folk religion and the edge of doctrine. The church forbade sorcery, but it also tolerated what it could not quite name. The line between wise woman and witch was blurred, especially in rural England before formal witch trials became widespread. Edith walked that line. She used herbs, but so did midwives. She knew charms, but so did many villagers quietly. She spoke of balance, not demons. She prayed sometimes, but not in Latin. And so she was tolerated, feared, revered, and left alone. Father Ulrich's dilemma. Privately, Father Ulrich was conflicted. He disliked Edith's influence. He had been taught that all power must come from God through the church. Yet Edith healed a child when he could not. She quoted scripture when it suited her. She committed no crimes, and she asked for nothing in return. He chose in the end to do nothing. He neither condemned her nor endorsed her. When asked about her, he would say, "We all serve the Lord in ways we do not fully understand." It was a careful answer. It was enough for now. A community changed. By the end of winter, something curious had happened. No one forgot the cat. No one forgot the omens. No one forgot the fear. But rather than driving Edith out, they adapted. They began leaving her small offerings, bread crusts, a sprig of lavender, a painted stone. Not because they feared her, at least, not entirely, but because they respected her place. Edith had become something like a living shrine, not holy, not cursed, but necessary. And the village, in turn, found balance again. Unresolved thought. What does it mean when a community creates its own sacred figures outside of the church? When a woman with herbs becomes more trusted than a priest with prayers? And what happens when power, once feared, becomes quietly woven into the fabric of daily life? Spring and the cat returns. It was a clear morning in early April when the cat was seen again. It sat just as before on the roof of the bakehouse, black, silent, still. By now the roof had been repaired, the wood beneath resealed, but something in the villagers' hearts stirred. They remembered. Children approached slowly. A few elders muttered that it was the same cat, others insisted it couldn't be. This one seemed thinner, its eyes less piercing, and yet something about its posture, the way it seemed to know, made people pause. Then, as before, the cat stayed for 3 days. But this time, no one panicked. No wells turned cloudy, no calves twisted, no geese flew backward. The villagers simply watched, waited, and whispered. On the 4th morning, the cat was gone again. A soft imprint remained in the ash on the oven's chimney stone. A village that remembered. By then, the story of the cat had settled into the rhythms of the village. Bread was broken and shared more intentionally. The forest path to Edith's house was no longer avoided, though still approached with respect. Children were told to mind their words around animals. And a curious custom emerged. During the first spring rain, villagers would place a dish of milk near their threshold, not for any specific cat, but as a gesture, a gift to the unknown. Father Ulrich turned a blind eye. He no longer mentioned charms in sermons. He had come to understand that certain beliefs, no matter how unofficial, anchored people to their world. The church remained the center of sacrament, but Edith's garden became the center of something older, a spiritual memory deeper than doctrine, rooted in place, earth, and quiet observation. Edith's final years. Edith lived another 5 years. In that time, she trained a young woman, Mary, the potter's niece, in herbs and the timing of blooms, in the sounds of water and the signs left by animals. Mary was not her daughter, but she became her inheritor, both of knowledge and of trust. When Edith died, she was buried at the edge of the forest, not in consecrated ground, but not far from the village either. Her grave was marked by a flat stone and a carved cat's face left, not by the priest, but by the blacksmith's son, who had once been healed of a fever by her salve. Father Ulrich did not perform a mass, but he stood at a distance as the villagers sang a lullaby she had taught them, one about moonlight, apples, and the silence between wind gusts. No one said the word witch, not anymore. The slow turn of time. As decades passed, the story of the cat changed. Some said it had been a spirit. Others said it was a test sent by angels. A few, daringly, whispered that it was Edith herself, long before she died, visiting the village in another shape. New priests came, a new manor lord whose steward insisted on more organized tithes. A fire consumed the bakehouse. A new one was built. Roads were improved. But through it all, the story endured. Children would point to rooftops and say, "That's where the witch's cat sat." Not with fear, but with a kind of wonder. From fear to folklore. Once the cat had been a symbol of unease, a dark omen, a living warning. Now it became part of village folklore, stories told during storms, lessons wrapped in rhyme. If a cat should stare and sit, do not throw, do not hit. Let it watch, let it stay, lest your bread rise the wrong way. No one believed it fully, but neither did they ignore it. It was that rare kind of story, half true, half believed, but wholly remembered. And in remembering, the village preserved something deeper than truth, a shared history, a lesson, a quiet sense of caution. Folk religion's endurance. By the late 14th century, as England changed and centralized, many such villages were drawn more firmly into the sphere of formal church practice. Superstition was discouraged. Clergy were trained to denounce charms and folk customs. New bishops cracked down on unlicensed healers. But in small, wooded villages like this one, folk belief never fully left. Because it had never been about rebellion. It had been about filling the spaces where official answers fell short, about explaining the odd turn of a season, the stillness of a cat, the sudden sickness of a child. The rituals remained not loud, not heretical, but woven into the seasons. Milk for the unseen, herbs on the lintel, silence in the woods. And yes, cats were still watched closely. The enduring power of the ordinary. What makes this story so remarkable is its ordinariness. There was no trial, no burning, no edict, just a small village, a mysterious cat, and the slow negotiation between fear, need, and belief. There was no climax, only change, slow and human. A woman mistrusted becomes revered. A community on edge becomes reflective. A superstition transforms into memory. These are the stories that rarely appear in grand histories. They leave no documents, no seals, no heraldry, but they linger in habits, in warnings, in lullabies, in the way a village treats a stranger or a cat. Final reflection. We often imagine medieval people as bound entirely to the church, fearful and rigid. But the truth is quieter and more nuanced. They lived in layers of belief, some official, some whispered, some woven into the woods. The story of the witch's cat reminds us that survival wasn't just about tools or food, it was also about meaning, about giving shape to fear, names to mystery, and rituals to what could not be controlled. And perhaps most of all, it shows that even in times of great suspicion, kindness and curiosity can prevail, if given enough time. Story 4. Farming without iron in 12th century Flanders. A field in Flanders, 1142. It was a cold, clear morning when the village plow broke. The field was half-turned, the soil damp from an early thaw, and the oxen snorted steam as they waited for the next command. The plowman, Jan of Stenbrug, gave a gentle cry, but when he pushed forward, the metal blade caught on a hidden stone, one that had shifted upward during the winter frosts. The blade cracked with a clean, high-pitched sound, almost like a bell. Jan cursed. The oxen stopped, and a dozen villagers, already lined up with baskets of seed and hoes, paused and looked on in silence. The iron coulter, the heart of the plow, had snapped, and there was no replacement. The importance of iron. In the 12th century, plows were more than tools. They were the dividing line between survival and hunger. A single heavy plow, drawn by oxen and fitted with a curved iron blade, could cut deep into the thick clay soils of northern Europe, turning over the earth in long, clean furrows that caught water, warmed early, and yielded better crops. Without iron, the villagers of Stenbrug were forced backward in time. Wooden scratch plows could not cut as deep. Hand tools, hoes, and spades were inefficient, especially in wet or compacted ground. The broken plow was not just an inconvenience, it was a crisis, and everyone knew it. The village economy. Stenbrug was a small community of about 120 souls, nestled between marsh and woodland in the county of Flanders, part of the patchwork that would later become modern Belgium. Their economy was fragile, resting on a tight balance of barley, flax, peas, and occasional livestock. Most families held strips of land in the open fields. These strips were rotated between fallow and planting, based on a communal calendar. And central to it all was the village plow, owned collectively but maintained by Jan and his family. There were blacksmiths in larger towns like Bruges or Eeklo, but they were miles away. And iron was expensive, too expensive for a single family to replace without help. So the villagers gathered in the alehouse that evening, their faces flushed not with drink, but worry. Options considered. The meeting was informal. No parchment, no charter. Just bodies crowded on benches, hands wrapped around mugs, eyes on the reeve, a practical man named Thomas. They discussed the options. Send for a smith from Bruges or Eeklo, but that would take days, and payment would be demanded up front. Trade goods, flax, preserved fish, cloth for iron, but the merchants who passed through wouldn't be back for weeks. Use wooden scratch plows in the meantime, but that would slow planting, and the spring window was narrow. Appeal to the abbey. A monastery 4 miles east had its own plows, and its monks occasionally lent tools in exchange for favors or field labor. After much back and forth, they agreed. Tomas would send his son and Jan's eldest to the abbey at first light. In the meantime, they would begin plowing by hand, digging with backs and spades. The next morning, the fields looked unchanged, but the work felt ancient. Men and women stood in lines, bending low, their spades and mattocks cutting the soil as best they could. Each stroke turned only a narrow strip. Where the plow would have completed an acre in a day, they would need a week, if not more. The mood was quiet. No one complained, but the pace of fear quickened. Every hour lost meant smaller yields. Smaller yields meant less surplus. Less surplus meant tighter belts, thinner ale, and more sickness when winter came again. They dug, not because it would be enough, but because there was no other choice. The abbey's decision. At the abbey of St. Lioba, the monks listened to the request with serene detachment. The prior, a bald, thin man named Brother Willem, explained that their own plow was in use. They were behind in their planting, too. But he said they would consider loaning it for the price of labor and spiritual penance. 3 days of field work, 1 barrel of pickled herring, and 2 loaves of fine wheat bread. The boys returned to Stenbrug with the offer. It was steep, but the villagers accepted. They pooled resources. Fish was drawn from winter stores. A woman with wheat saved for Easter baking offered her flour. The deal was made. But it would be 5 more days before the plow arrived, brought on a creaking cart, escorted by a silent lay brother and a sleepy monk who read psalms as the oxen walked. 5 days of manual labor. During those 5 days, the villagers returned to older methods. Some had heard stories from elders about farming before iron. They revived the use of ard plows, narrow wooden tools pulled by human strength or donkeys. They broke up soil in tight loops, inch by inch. Children were tasked with dropping seed directly into shallow trenches made with sticks. Women carried baskets of manure from winter stalls, spreading it with their hands. They sang work songs not to lift spirits but to keep rhythm. The songs were old, half in Flemish, half in Latin, with verses no one fully understood. In this shared hardship, a kind of clarity returned. Not ease, not comfort, but unity. The return of the plow. When the abbey's plow finally arrived, it was greeted like a holy relic. It gleamed slightly from polish. Its iron edge was sharper than what Stenbrug had owned in years. The oxen were borrowed from the steward's team, and Jan stepped up to the yoke with quiet reverence. The first furrow it cut that morning was straight and deep, the earth curling away like paper from a knife. People cheered not loudly, but with the kind of relief that runs deep. Over the next week they worked in shifts, covering as much ground as they could. The monk offered prayers in the fields. A few villagers joined him. Even the reeve knelt at one point, muttering a half-familiar prayer. By the time the plow returned to the abbey, the fields were mostly turned. But the memory of those 5 days without it had left a mark. Unresolved thought. They had learned what it meant to lose the metal and to find a way forward without it. But what would they change now? Would they prepare differently? Or would the rhythms of normalcy return, burying the memory like a seed beneath the spring soil? The fields half-turned. By the time the abbey's plow returned to St. Lioba, Stenbrug's fields were only partially planted. Some rows were straight and clean, those done with the borrowed plow. Others were shallow, crooked, and uneven, dug by hand or scratched by wooden ards. No one celebrated. The planting season had closed, and the villagers knew the truth. This would be a lean year. The damage had not come from war, nor pestilence, nor storm. It had come from something much simpler, a single fracture in a single tool. And yet, it had exposed everything: their dependence on outside trade, their fragility, and the narrowness of their margin for error. But what followed in the weeks after the planting was not collapse. It was adaptation. The reeve's inventory. Tomas, the reeve, took it upon himself to document the village's tools. Not on parchment, there was no scribe, but in conversation, through memory, and with rough carvings in wood. He made a simple tally. Number of scythes, 6, 2 with cracks. Hoes, 9. Spades, 7 usable, 3 worn to nubs. Ard plows, 2 both old. Ox yokes, 3. Metal plowshares, 0. It was not just a list, it was a reckoning. Tomas proposed a tool-sharing system. Households would pool what they had, and usage would be scheduled in cycles. Repairs would be done communally. The smith's apprentice, barely trained, was tasked with sharpening and patching what he could. There were grumblings. Some villagers did not like to share. Others feared tools would be broken or borrowed without return. But under the memory of the failed planting, they agreed. And slowly, this tool commons began to work. Iron dreams. One evening in June, after the last seeds were planted, Jen the plowman sat by the fire with his son Willem. They spoke of tools not in the abstract, but as living things. A plow, Jan said, isn't just iron and wood, it's a season. One blade turns the earth or it doesn't, that's the year. Willem, only 13, asked why they didn't make their own iron. Jan smiled thinly, because we haven't the mine or the heat or the time. The nearest bloomery furnace, a place to smelt iron, was a half-day's travel away. Iron came dear, shaped by artisans, traded by merchants, or gifted by lords. Still, the boy's question lingered. An unexpected visitor. In July, a traveling tinker came to the village. He rode a mule with bent legs and carried a cart of tools, odds, ends, and bits of scrap metal. His arrival was rare. Tinkers came perhaps once a year, if that, and he was immediately surrounded. He examined the broken plowshare. Old work, he said. Soft iron, probably brittle from overuse. Could he mend it? Not here, but I've got something that might fit if you've got something to trade. The villagers gathered what they could. Beeswax, dried apples, linen scraps, and 2 brass buttons from a steward's coat. It was enough. The tinker produced a reforged blade, dull but usable, and helped Jan fit it to the wooden frame. It wasn't perfect, but it would last a season, maybe 2. The tinker moved on, but he left behind more than a blade. He left the possibility of repair. A shift in thinking. After the tinker's visit, something changed in Stenbrug. The villagers began to rethink their dependence on outside iron. They couldn't smelt, but they could collect. Broken tools were no longer discarded, they were stored. Worn-out horseshoes, snapped nails, warped blades, all were kept. A new idea emerged: metal reserves. They began to stockpile small bits of iron for future emergencies. Tomas built a box in the alehouse cellar where scrap was placed. Anyone could contribute. Anyone could use it if the need was clear. It was not formal, it was not perfect, but it was the beginning of something like community planning. A visit from the manor steward. In August, the steward of the local lord visited Stenbrug to inspect the harvest expectations. He found half-grown fields, thin stalks, and tired faces. The steward, a narrow-eyed man named Gilbert, demanded to know why yields were low. Tomas explained briefly about the broken plow. Gilbert sneered, "One tool and the village withers." But he noted it, he had to. The church took tithe in grain. The manor took rents in barley. If there was no crop, there would be no tax. If there was no tax, the Lord would lose. Later that day, Gilbert summoned Tomas privately and asked gruffly, "How much would a replacement cost?" Tomas named a sum. Gilbert did not answer, but the next spring a new blade arrived from the manor forge. No note, no thanks, just iron on a cart. What was lost and what was kept? That year's harvest was poor. There was no famine, but reserves were emptied. Salted meat ran low by Christmas. Winter meals were heavy on beans and boiled roots. But no one starved. And come spring, planting began earlier, faster, more efficiently. Why? Because the villagers had changed. They had reorganized their tools. They had learned to maintain and repair. They had accepted that failure wasn't fate, only warning. The iron was back, but they had learned how to live without it and how to make sure they wouldn't have to again. Seeds of self-reliance. Willem, now 14, proposed building a simple forge not for smelting but for heating and reshaping scrap. The blacksmith laughed, then paused, then nodded. With help they constructed a clay and stone hearth by the edge of the field. It could not make new blades, but it could sharpen, it could bend, it could patch. Willem's generation, born in the shadow of the broken plow, would not forget. And the forge remained, smoking gently in the mornings, a quiet answer to last year's silence. Unresolved thought. The plow had returned. The fields were full again. But would the memory of that broken spring truly shape the seasons to come, or would time wear it smooth like a well-used blade? A year remembered. The year the plow broke was remembered for generations, not because it brought death or ruin, but because it nearly did, and in nearly doing so, it taught. By the spring of 1143, the fields of Stenbrug were again striped with furrows, some deep and straight, others still shallow and curved. The new blade, gifted quietly by the manor, was heavier and sharper. The oxen moved steadily. The seed baskets were full. But there was something new in the air, not celebration, but vigilance. The villagers did not trust the plow to remain whole. They had learned that iron fails, and when it does, only preparation endures. The rise of Willem the smith. Willem, the plowman's son, had taken quickly to the forge. His tools were simple, bellows made from stitched leather, a stone hearth, tongs hammered from scrap. He learned to heat and reshape bent hinges, dull hooks, and broken blades. His first plowshare cracked, the second warped. But the third cut soil. By the time he was 16, Willem was known not just as Jan's boy, but as the smith's heir, though there had never been a smith in the village before. His work allowed Stenbrug to mend its own tools. For the first time, the villagers didn't wait for a tinker or trader. They had taken a skill of the towns and brought it to the fields. This was not rebellion, it was resilience. New customs. Out of that season of loss came new habits, not rules, just quiet expectations. At the end of each planting season, tools were blessed by the priest, not just the seed. After the harvest, every household contributed a small scrap of metal, nail, coin, worn buckle to the village forge. A plow watch was established. One man each week inspected the communal plow for cracks, rust, or wear. And before the first furrow each spring, the plowman, now sometimes Jan, sometimes Willem, would stop at the field's edge and say a short phrase. For the earth, for the blade, for the bread. No one remembered who started it, but it became a tradition. The abbeson's word. In the summer of 1144, a monk from St. Leoba returned to the village not to collect, but to observe. He asked questions about the forge, about the repairs, about the shared metal reserve, and then he offered something unexpected, a gift. 2 iron blanks, unshaped plowshares, raw steel from the abbey's forge. He said the abbey had heard of the village's efforts and wished to support their industrious spirit. In truth, it may have been a political gesture, a way to maintain influence in a region growing quietly self-reliant. But the villagers accepted, gratefully, respectfully. And they melted one of the blanks down to make not a blade, but smaller tools, chisels, nails, hinges. The iron became many things, not just one. The blade symbol. Over time, the broken blade, the one that had failed in 1142, was mounted above the door of the alehouse. Not as a warning, but as a reminder. Visitors asked about it, and villagers would tell the story not dramatically, but with calm pride. That's when we learned to think ahead, they'd say. That's when Willem built the forge. That's when we stopped waiting for someone to fix what we could mend ourselves. It became a quiet kind of origin story, not unlike how towns spoke of founding saints or battles. Only this was no miracle, just a break, a pause, a lesson. The quiet shaping of power. Something else had changed. The manor steward no longer issued orders about the fields without first speaking to the reeve. The villagers did not rebel, but they negotiated. When the tax was too high, they explained the soil was poor. When asked to send laborers to town, they countered with what they needed in return. They had no charter, no paper of rights, but they had something better, proof that they could survive when forgotten. That was a kind of power, a humble inheritance. Jan the plowman died in 1148, a quiet death in the late days of harvest. He had lived long enough to see his son become a respected smith and to see the village stand strong in a hard season. At his burial, no one spoke long eulogies. They did not have the custom, but as his coffin passed the alehouse, the procession paused beneath the broken blade. A single handful of soil was thrown at the base of the blade. Later, Willem said his father had once whispered to him, "A man should be remembered not for the bread he ate, but for the blade he passed on." Willem carved those words into the forge's beam. The memory of tools. Centuries later, the village of Stenbrug would fade from maps. Floods would change the rivers. Roads would shift. The fields would be plowed by men who never knew Jan, Willem, or Thomas. But for a time, in that corner of 12th century Flanders, a single broken plow changed the shape of a community's memory. Not through heroes, not through battle, but through a cracked blade, a communal forge, a child asking why, and a village that chose to remember instead of forget. Final reflection. In great histories, we often focus on kings and castles, wars and treaties, but much of human survival has depended on quieter things: tools, skills, cooperation. The broken plow of Stenbrug is not a tale of crisis. It is a story of readiness born too late, and wisdom that came just in time. It shows us that even the smallest crack can reveal the deepest truths, and that, sometimes, history turns not with the stroke of a sword, but with the weight of a blade in soil. Story 5. The Dead River, when the water dried up in Bayonne. A river of certainty. In the summer of 1279, the people of Bayonne in the western foothills of the Pyrenees woke to a world that felt subtly, terribly wrong. The Rivière du Cid, a thin but steady current that wound gently through the village of Montaigut, had slowed in the spring, a thing not entirely uncommon, but by late June it had stopped. Not slowed to a trickle, not evaporated to puddles. It was simply gone. Where water had always been cool, shallow, brown with clay, and full of darting fish, there was now only dry stone, cracked mud, a smell like old eggs. The villagers stared at the riverbed in silence. It was a thing they had never seen, a thing they had not imagined was possible. The river's role. The Rivière du Cid was not grand. It was not navigable. It did not bring trade or travelers, but it was vital. It watered the common fields and the manor's vineyards. It turned the wheel of the small grist mill downstream. It fed the livestock. It cooled pots and cleaned hands and baptized infants. The village had no well. It had no irrigation. It had the river. It had always been there, not abundant but reliable. Even during the driest years, it had never stopped entirely. Until now. First responses: denial and delay. At first, no one panicked. People assumed it would return with the next storm or overnight from snowmelt in the mountains. They told each other, "It's only a dry patch. The gods have blinked. The mountains will remember us." But days passed, then a week. The stones stayed dry. The mill stopped first. No grinding meant no fresh flour. Bread had to be made from what grain had already been milled. The baker began rationing loaves. Then the animals grew restless. The watering troughs dried, and cows refused the tepid water from clay jars. Chickens roamed toward the riverbed and pecked at the stones. The villagers began to feel fear. The steward's explanation. The steward of the local viscount, a man named Guy de Fortin, arrived to inspect the fields. When he heard of the river's disappearance, he furrowed his brow and gave a vague explanation. The mountains are cold this year. Snow has stayed longer. It will flow again. But Guy had no expertise. His job was to collect taxes and ensure order. He offered no solutions, only assurance. He promised the Viscount would be informed. The Viscount, of course, was in Pau, attending a feast. No aid came. The search for water. As the third week passed, the villagers began digging. Not wells. No one in the village had the tools or skill for proper well digging, but pits, shallow holes in the soft earth near the riverbed. They hoped to find seepage or hidden springs. Children helped, using hands and sticks. A few found damp patches, enough to soak cloth to fill a small jug over hours, but not enough for life. Then, on the 12th day, a man named Ramon claimed to have found water flowing faintly from a crack near the chapel. They dug carefully. By nightfall, there was a thin stream, no wider than a finger. They cupped it with palms. A girl was given the first sip. It tasted of iron, but it was water. Superstition and suspicion. In the absence of explanation, superstition rose like steam. The old said the river had been angered, that it had been offended by something left in its banks. One woman claimed she had seen a snake with 2 heads near the bridge 2 days before it dried. A boy insisted he'd thrown a stone at a frog and the water had hissed. Edmé the weaver, who had long been suspected of knowing too much, was blamed by some. They said she had cursed the river after her son drowned in it 2 summers prior. Someone painted a red mark on her door. But no one harmed her, not yet. The church responds. The parish priest, Father Martin, declared a day of fasting and prayer. He urged the village to confess its sins, to cleanse the soul of the community. He led a procession down the empty riverbed. Psalms were sung, banners were carried. The cross was lifted where water once flowed. At the place where baptisms were once performed, the priest stopped and spoke. This water was given by God. If he withholds it, we must ask why. No answer came, but the ritual provided structure. For one day, the panic held still. Adaptation begins. Villagers began to shift routines. Laundry was done with damp cloth and ash. Cooking was simplified, grains boiled with wine or milk, not water. Bathing stopped entirely, except for the ill. Livestock were watered at dawn and dusk, with pooled runoff from roof gutters. A bucket of clear water became more valuable than bread. Fights broke out. One man stole from a neighbor's barrel. A woman smacked her cousin for drawing 2 ladles instead of 1. But mostly they cooperated, because they had no choice. Dry dust and the memory of fish. Children, once thrilled by the appearance of the dry riverbed, grew somber. They missed the flicker of minnows in shallow pools, the sucking mud that clung to their feet, the way the river murmured at night, a sound that had lulled the village to sleep for generations. Now there was only silence. The dust from the riverbed began to blow into homes. It clung to walls. It left a pale film on cheese and apples. It got into lungs. Edmé, the weaver, gathered river stones and placed them in a ring around her hearth. She said it was to remind the house of what it had lost. Some copied her. The strangers claim. In early August, a stranger arrived. He was thin, sun-darkened, and wore boots caked with red clay. He said he came from the south, where other rivers had vanished. He claimed the earth was drying not just here, but across Aquitaine and Gascony. You think your river died, he said, but rivers don't die, they go into hiding. He told of hidden streams, old springs in forgotten places, and dry spells that lasted 3 years. The villagers listened. They didn't know whether to believe him, but one thing he said lingered. The land remembers where it's been wet. You just have to look where the moss grows thickest. Unresolved thought. The river was gone, and yet life went on. Slower, thirstier, stranger, but still going. What happens to a village when the thing it trusted most, its water, vanishes without warning? Do people adapt? Or do they begin to fade like the stones the river once kissed? The long wait. By mid-August, the villagers of Montagut no longer expected the river to return. They still looked at the dry bed each morning, still hoped for the glimmer of wet stone or the sound of trickling through reeds, but these had become habits, not hopes. The dust was everywhere now, coating the flax in the fields and settling in the folds of wool cloaks. Even the dogs had stopped barking at birds along the bank. There were none. And so life narrowed. Meals were reduced to once a day. Water was stored under lock and key, hidden in clay jars beneath cool floors. Singing stopped in the evenings. No one had breath to spare. It was not famine, not pestilence, not war. It was just thirst, patient and endless. The dry marriage. In September, a wedding was held, a rare act of defiance, or perhaps resilience. Agnes, the miller's niece, and Tevin, the flax comber's son, had been betrothed before the river vanished. Postponement had been considered, but the priest said, "If we delay every joy for fear of hardship, there will be no joy left." The ceremony was held beside the empty riverbed. A simple arch of woven willow was erected where the water once rippled. Instead of washing the couple's hands in the river, as tradition demanded, Father Martin anointed them with a single drop of holy water squeezed carefully from a damp cloth. Some cried, others looked away. A feast followed, but it was modest goat cheese, stewed cabbage, and dry bread. The ale was thin, but the people danced slowly, and for a few hours the village remembered how to celebrate. Moss and memory. Inspired by the stranger's words, villagers began searching for new water. They looked where moss grew thickest on north-facing stones, at the base of tree roots, beneath the ruins of the old Roman road. They dug with trowels, knives, even bare hands. And sometimes they found it. A pocket of seepage beneath a boulder near the chapel. A cold trickle through sand under the goat pasture. A slow drip in the hollow of a fallen tree. None of it was enough for washing or brewing, but enough for sipping, enough to believe. These little springs were named. The tree's tongue. Ramon's patch. The widow's pulse. Each family guarded their find but also shared a little, according to unspoken rules. One ladle for the sick, one ladle for the infant, one for the baker, whose oven now went cold half the week. Water had become not only resource but ritual. The silence of the Lord. The Viscount never came. His steward sent word, saying repairs are being considered. What repairs could mend a river, no one knew. Taxes were still demanded, and when they could not be paid in grain, cloth, or eggs were accepted. But there was no relief. The priest, pressed by his flock, wrote a letter to the bishop in Lescar. No reply came. The villagers began to understand that they were on their own. And with that understanding came something close to peace. The death of the cow. In early October, the last dairy cow died. It had been tethered too far from the shaded water pits and collapsed in the heat. Its name was Belle. A child wept when it happened. The meat was shared, not happily but with reverence. The bones were boiled. The hide was dried. A small cross was carved into the riverbed near where it used to drink, not because the cow was sacred, but because she had been familiar, a creature of the river. And now she was gone. The ritual of stones. A new custom emerged as the drought stretched on. Each family placed a river stone at the base of their hearth. Some arranged them in circles. Others stacked them in three, always three. At night, people would press their palms to the stone before bed, not praying necessarily, just remembering. Children were told, the stone remembers the river even if we forget. This was not from the church. Father Martin did not encourage it, but neither did he forbid it. He, too, had placed a stone beside the altar. A boy's dream. One evening, a boy named Luke, son of the flax comber, told his mother he had dreamed of water. He said he was walking the riverbed when a fish leapt from a puddle and landed in his hands. The fish whispered, "Follow the moss to the hill." Luke had never been more than a mile from the village. But his dream stirred something. The next morning, a small group followed him to the western rise, where the moss did grow thick along the old stone wall. They dug, and they found a spring, shallow but steady. They named it Luke's Whisper, a different kind of faith. By November, the villagers no longer asked when the river would return. They focused instead on how to live without it. The forge was cooled with wine lees and brine. Pottage was made with milk or rendered fat. Communion wine was diluted beyond tradition. And people began gathering not in the church, but at the edge of the dry bed where new rituals formed. Someone no one knew, who began placing wreaths of willow in the center of the stones. Another left a small carved fish made from bone. These were not heresies, they were memories, acts of care, ways to speak to the thing that was missing. Father Martin came one evening, knelt beside a wreath and said nothing. Sometimes silence is prayer. The first rain. On the third night of December, the rain came. Not a storm, not a torrent, just a slow, soft drizzle like the earth was remembering itself. Children woke and ran outside. They turned their faces upward and opened their mouths. Dogs barked. Old women wept. But the riverbed remained dry. The rain continued for 4 days, never heavy, never certain, but enough to fill buckets, enough to rinse the dust from leaves, enough to soften hope. And on the 5th morning, a puddle appeared beneath the stone bridge. Unresolved thought. The river was not yet back, but the people were still here, and that perhaps mattered more. When something ancient and constant disappears, what do we replace it with? Do we wait forever? Or do we learn to dig differently, to remember together, to ritualize survival? A trickling return. By early January of 1280, the puddles beneath the bridge had become a trickle, winding softly along the lowest folds of the riverbed. It made no sound, no rush or burble, just the wet shine of movement. It was first noticed by a goat who bent to sniff the stones, then lapped the muddy water and bleated once, sharply. A herder boy saw it and ran to the village square. The news spread in whispers, then shouts, then silence. No one cheered. Instead, they gathered at the bridge and stood, coats damp, breath in clouds, staring at the water that was no longer gone. Some crossed themselves. A few wept quietly. The priest, Father Martin, knelt and touched it with the tip of his finger. The river had returned, but not all at once. Not the same river. What came back was not the river they remembered. It was thinner. It carried no fish. It smelled faintly of metal and silt. And its current was hesitant, pausing at turns as though relearning its path. The people did not jump to use it. They watched, they waited. Days passed before a woman filled a single jar from the edge. A week later, the baker used a pail of river water to scrub his stone. A month after that, the first child was baptized in it again. The river had to earn back their trust. And so it did slowly, daily, drop by drop. What stayed dry? Not everything came back. The old mill, once driven by the river's force, was never rebuilt. The animals, once watered at troughs beside the bank, were now led to the hill springs Ramon's patch, Luke's Whisper. The ritual of stones remained in each home, even after the water flowed. People no longer saw the river as inevitable. They now saw it as fragile, a companion, not a constant. It had taught them how to live without it, and in that, had become something different. A new kind of ritual. That spring, during the first thaw, the villagers held a new ceremony. They walked the length of the riverbed, not to pray for its return, but to thank it for staying. They brought their stones with them, each hearthstone that had sat through the dry season, and laid them at the water's edge in a long, curving line. Father Martin offered no formal mass. Instead, he read a passage from Ezekiel about water flowing from dry places. Then the children danced. It was not a loud ceremony, but it was complete. Edme's choice. Edme the weaver, once suspected of dark influence, had never left the village, nor retaliated for the mark painted on her door. She had kept weaving, had offered cloth to new mothers, had said little. But when the river returned, she did something no one expected. She moved her loom outside, beside the bank. Each morning, she worked where others could see. She said the sound of running water helped her pattern the threads. Over time, more people began to visit her, not for curses or potions, but for conversation, for cloth, for questions. Suspicion had faded. All that remained was respect. The springs remained sacred. Though the river was back, the hill springs remained in use, not out of necessity but ritual. Luke's whisper was used to bless tools before planting. The widow's pulse became the place where girls braided hair on Midsummer's Eve. The tree's tongue was said to cure cracked skin in winter. The people knew these waters, now knew where to find them, knew how to protect them. They were not replacements for the river, they were reminders. When asked why they still used them, one elder replied, "Because they answered when the river did not." A letter to the bishop. That summer, the Bishop of Lescar finally replied. His letter, written in Latin and carried by a sweating courier, expressed concern over the reports of drought. He included a prayer for rain and instructions to conduct regular water blessings. Father Martin read it aloud, then set it aside. By then, the river had been flowing for 5 months. The people politely ignored the bishop's suggestions. They had already found their own liturgies, ones born not of Rome, but of dry hands, empty jars, and quiet resolve. A generation marked. The children who had lived through the dry river year were different. They were cautious with water, they drank slowly, they listened for flow, they bathed only when needed. As they grew into adults, they passed on stories of the missing river, how their parents dug with sticks, how goats drank from stones, how a boy's dream led to a spring. These stories were not told to frighten, but to remember. And when, decades later, the river ran low again during a dry spring, those children, now elders, knew what to do. They did not panic. They dug where moss grew thickest. An inscription in stone. Years after the river's return, the villagers carved a message into a flat stone and set it near the bridge. It was not grand or poetic, just a single line. Here the water left us, here we stayed. People touched it when they crossed the river. Children traced the letters with their fingers. It was not a monument to tragedy. It was a reminder of endurance. Final reflection. Rivers are not just water. They are memory, rhythm, trust. When they vanish, something deeper is shaken, our sense that the world will stay the same. But the people of Montegut learned that survival is not just about waiting for the water to return. It is about digging new holes, nomming new springs, and sharing the last ladle with a neighbor. Their story teaches us this. Even when the river forgets you, you do not have to forget each other. Story 6. Superstition and Silence in a Breton Church. The Bell and the Wind. The village of Curzu, tucked between low hills in coastal Brittany, was known for very little except its bell. Hung in the tower of the church of Saint Gainale, the bell had rung every day for as long as anyone could remember. It called the living to Mass, marked the hours of work, tolled for the dead, and was rung in times of storm and mourning. It was not a large bell nor a beautiful one. Its tone was low, hollow, weathered by sea air and salt winds. But it was trusted. So when, in the winter of 1310, it stopped ringing, the people of Kurzu didn't simply note the silence, they felt it in their bones. The first silence. It happened on a morning like any other. The sky was the color of wet slate. The smell of fish lingered in the thatch. The bell ringer, Mark, a young man of strong arms and calloused hands, arrived at dawn to sound the Angelus. He gripped the rope, braced his feet, pulled. Nothing. He pulled again, the rope moved, the bell did not. No sound. He climbed the tower, thinking the clapper had broken or the bell had shifted, but nothing seemed wrong. The rope moved cleanly. The clapper hung straight. But the bell would not ring. Attempts and accusations. Over the next few days, the villagers tried everything. Mark was replaced with the priest. The bell was rubbed with oil and wine. A stone was thrown against it from within. A child was sent to try just in case. Each attempt yielded the same result: silence. The bell swayed, but no tone came. People stood beneath the tower and stared, waiting for a sound that did not arrive. And soon the whispers began. It's not the bell. It's us. Something has changed. The priest's explanation. Father Ronan, a stern man of advancing years, addressed the village on the 5th day. He said the bell was a tool, not a god. He reminded them that metal breaks, that weather changes sound. He quoted Job and Psalms, spoke of the tests of faith, and advised patience. But even he looked upward with uncertainty when he said these things. Because the bell had not cracked, it had not fallen, it was whole. And yet it refused to speak. Superstition awakens. This was Brittany, and Brittany in the early 14th century was full of old memory. Before Christianity came with its saints and Latin, the land had been rich with stone circles, tree cults, and whispered tales of spirits in the sea mist. The church had built itself atop these things, but the people remembered. So when the bell fell silent, the villagers turned not publicly, not loudly, but inward, toward those older fears. One man claimed the bell had been touched by a cord, a Breton fey creature. Another said that the bell had once been cast using the silver of a drowned sailor, and now that sailor had returned to reclaim it. A woman buried her comb in the field to protect her family from the soundless wind. No one laughed. A bell that refused the dead. Traditionally, the bell tolled for the dead, 3 long peals for a man, 2 for a woman, 1 for a child. So when a fisherman named Elaine died in a boat wreck during the 2nd week of silence, the villagers were afraid. Father Ronan tried again to ring the bell. He climbed the tower himself, in full vestments, pulled the rope, prayed aloud. Nothing. Elaine was buried without the bell. His wife refused to speak during the burial. Some said she believed his soul could not find peace without the sound to guide him. Others agreed. A village in suspended time. The rhythm of life had changed. Mass was still held, but attendance faltered. Work in the field slowed. No one knew when to begin or stop. Meals felt adrift. Weddings were delayed. No one wanted to be married in a church that had no voice. The bell had become more than a tool. It had been a clock, a witness, a sacred presence. Now, without it, the village felt unanchored. The silence was not peaceful. It was unsettling, like waiting for thunder that never came. The stranger's arrival. In the 3rd week, a stranger arrived. He wore a dark blue cloak and spoke French with a southern lilt. He said he had heard of the silent bell and asked to see it. No one knew who had told him. Perhaps word had spread to the nearby towns. Perhaps the bishop had sent him. He examined the bell without speaking. He traced the inscription's faint Latin words no one could read. Then he turned to Father Ronan and said, "It is not broken, it is refusing." He would not explain further. That night he slept in the sacristy. In the morning he was gone. Reactions to the silence. Villagers began to react in different ways. Some ignored it, pretending the silence was unimportant. Some turned to older charms, burning salt, tying red threads around door handles. One man carved a wooden bell and placed it on his roof. The children began a game. They'd take turns ringing imaginary bells and pretending to hear them. Father Ronan grew thin. His sermons became shorter. He avoided the bell tower. Mark the bell ringer, once a lively boy, became withdrawn. He walked the riverbank at night. Some said he was speaking to the water. The silence had become more than absence. It had become a presence. Unresolved thought. The bell that would not ring had not failed. It had simply stopped. No crack, no fall, no decay. Was it waiting for something? Was it punishing someone? Or was it trying to say what could not be heard? Silence takes root. By the start of Lent in 1311, the silence in Kurzu was no longer a disturbance. It had become a condition like fog or the sea's tide. No one expected the bell to ring anymore. Some barely remembered what it sounded like. Children born that winter had never heard it. They were being raised in a world where the church's voice, its singular, constant tone, was simply absent. Mark the bell ringer had stopped trying. He still climbed the tower once a week, mostly out of duty, perhaps habit. He would pull the rope 3 times, hear nothing, then descend and leave without a word. People nodded at him in the lane. No one asked if he'd try again. The bell had become, somehow, both sacred and mute. A soundless burial. In early March, the village buried its oldest resident, Old Mother Ussing. She had survived 2 famines, 3 bishops, and the death of all her sons at sea. She had once claimed to have seen a white stag at the edge of the forest and insisted her dreams predicted weather. Her passing was solemn. The villagers wanted a proper toll. So they gathered at the tower, more than 60 people in their heaviest cloaks, and watched as Mark took the rope in hand. He pulled once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. Then something peculiar happened. A child, small, silent, perhaps 5 years old, began to hum, a long, low tone, then another joined, then another. They stood in the cold, surrounding the bell that would not ring, and hummed its voice for it. The funeral proceeded. No one commented on the humming afterward, but some continued the practice at home, humming softly during prayers, during meals, when someone passed. The sound of the bell had become a memory kept alive by breath. The priest's lament. Father Ronan began to falter. His voice, once measured and unyielding, had grown brittle. His hands trembled at the altar. His sermons wandered. One Sunday, during a particularly thin service, he stood silently for nearly 10 minutes before whispering, "If the bell no longer calls us, do we still come?" It was not a question to be answered. Some thought he had lost faith. Others believed he had simply grown old. But all agreed that something in him had shifted, like a door that had closed quietly in the night. The tower's whisper. One foggy evening in April, Mark the bell ringer lingered in the tower after his usual attempt. He sat beside the great bronze bell, staring at it in the fading light. He said later quietly, only to his cousin, that he had heard something. Not a bell, not exactly. It was a breath, a vibration, like something inside the metal was asleep and had stirred for the first time in months. The cousin told no one at first, but word got out. And just like that, hope returned, not loudly, but in corners, in glances, in half-said things. The reappearance of the stranger. That spring, the stranger in the blue cloak returned. He was thinner, his boots were cracked, but he walked straight to the church and waited. Father Ronan allowed him into the tower. The 2 men spoke alone for some time. Then the stranger climbed into the belfry, touched the bell with both hands, and said 3 words in a language no one recognized. When he came down, he told the priest, "The bell must choose to ring." Then he left for the second and final time. The quiet crisis. By May, a deeper problem had emerged. Without the bell, the village had no timekeeper. Church bells didn't only call for mass, they marked work, rest, feasting, mourning. They were the heartbeat of rural life. Now people began to argue. Was it too early to harvest barley? When should the animals be let in? When did the fast end? A kind of confusion settled over the village, not chaos, but disorientation, like a ship drifting without stars. The silence was no longer just unsettling. It was beginning to unravel order. The attempt at a new bell. That summer, the villagers tried to commission a new bell. They melted scrap metal and paid a traveling smith to cast a small one no larger than a stew pot. It was hung from a simple wooden post beside the church. Mark rang it with a wooden mallet. It made a high, thin sound, cheerful, childish. But it was not the bell. People listened politely, then ignored it. The tower bell still hung vast, unmoving, central. The new bell rang, but no one came when it did. It became clear. The silence wasn't about sound. It was about what had been lost. The memory of the old bell. The villagers began to remember stories of the bell. How it had tolled during the storm of 1286, guiding sailors back to shore. How it had rung through the fog when a child was lost. How it had pealed wildly the day a bishop visited 3 times more than was proper, because Mark had been nervous. It had been part of their lives in ways they hadn't noticed until it stopped. The bell had been more than a signal. It had been a witness, a presence, a voice older than memory. Now it was silent, and still no one could say why. A new practice. By late summer, a new ritual took shape. Each Sunday, after Mass, the villagers would walk around the church tower in silence once for every month the bell had not rung. At the end of the walk, they would sit on the grass and listen. They didn't speak, they didn't sing. They simply sat in the shadow of the silent bell and waited. For what? No one knew. But somehow, the ritual made things bearable. Unresolved thought. If a bell refuses to ring, is it broken or is it speaking in another language? And if that language is silence, can we learn to listen to it? The turning of the year. As the year turned toward winter again, the village of Kurzu had nearly completed a full cycle without its bell. The people had learned to live by sunlight and shadow, animal calls and habit rather than tone and toll. Time flowed strangely. Some days felt endless, others passed unnoticed. The new bell on the wooden post still rang. The smith had since gone, and the villagers took turns striking it politely before meals and mass, but it had never caught on. The old bell silent, massive, unmoving, hung in the tower like a closed eye, watching but unblinking. Mark, the bell ringer, continued to climb the steps once each week. He never stopped trying, even as others stopped watching. Mark's prayer. In early December, on a morning dense with mist, Mark entered the tower alone. He placed a stone by the door, something the villagers had begun doing at births and burials, as silent gestures of presence. He did not pull the rope. Instead, he sat beside it and spoke. No grand plea, no formal prayer, just a quiet recounting. Of the first day it failed. Of the faces he saw when it didn't ring. Of the humming children at the funeral. Of his own fear that something inside him had been silenced, too. Then, almost as an afterthought, he stood and pulled once. Still silence. He bowed his head, whispered, "Thank you for listening," and left. A bell for the lost. That week a merchant passed through Kurzu rare, as trade caravans had mostly avoided the quiet village. He brought salt, wool, and a story. He told of a church 2 days east, where their bell had also stopped ringing the year before. But theirs had returned, not through repair or ritual but by grief. The bell rang during a funeral with no hand upon the rope. A widow was being buried, and as the final prayer was spoken, the bell let out a single, clean toll. The merchant left the next morning. The villagers of Kurzu stood in the square, wondering aloud. Was their silence unique? Or was the land itself forgetting how to sing? The ice storm. In January 1312, an ice storm rolled in from the sea. Trees cracked, boats capsized in the harbor, roofs sagged under frozen weight. In the tower, the bell stood stiff, encased in a film of glittering frost. No one approached it for 2 days. The steps were too slick, the air too still. On the third morning, the sun returned, and the frost began to melt. Thin droplets clung to the bell's lip. A blackbird perched nearby and cocked its head. And then, the bell rang. The sound. It was not loud, it was not forceful. But it was real. A deep, resonant single tone, followed by silence. Then, a minute later, another. Mark had not been in the tower, nor had the priest, nor any villager. No hand had touched the rope. People emerged from their homes, eyes wide, ears straining. Another toll, a fourth. The bell rang 7 times that morning, each one slightly louder than the last. By the 7th, dogs barked, children cried, old men removed their hats. Father Ronan dropped to his knees and said nothing. What followed? The bell returned, but not entirely. It did not ring every day. Sometimes it would remain silent for weeks, then sound once perhaps at dusk or when the fog lifted. It never responded to the rope again. Mark still climbed the tower, but instead of pulling, he would sit beside it as if waiting for permission. Over time, the villagers stopped asking it to ring. They listened. They noted when it chose to speak. A birth, a sudden death, a strange wind. The bell had become something else, not a tool, but a presence, a companion, perhaps even a kind of oracle. Father Ronan's final sermon. The priest, now aged and pale, gave a short sermon on Candlemas. He said, "The bell is not ours. It never was. It speaks when it must. We were never its master, only its keeper." Then he stepped down from the altar. That was his last public appearance. He died quietly the following spring. At his burial, the bell rang once. A change in the people. Kurzu was never the same again. The children grew into adults who never fully trusted sound. The villagers developed new customs around quiet moments of daily stillness, where all conversation ceased. Some began to say that the bell listened, and so they spoke gently around it. No one ever tried to cast a new bell again. A generation later, a young priest asked the elders why they hadn't replaced the bell when it first went quiet. The answer, spoken by a woman who had once hummed during her mother's funeral. Because it wasn't broken, it was thinking. The bell and the sea. Fishermen reported that, sometimes, far out beyond the cove, they could hear the bell tolling faintly through the mist even when it hadn't rung in the village. They said the sea remembered it. No one knew if this was true. But on stormy nights when the wind howled and boats creaked in their moorings, many villagers claimed they heard it, just once, carried on the salt air. A deep, resonant hum. Final reflection. There are silences that are empty, and then there are silences that contain everything. The bell in Kurzu did not fail. It withdrew, it waited, it listened. And in its silence, the people learned to listen, too, not just for sound but for meaning. Perhaps that is the lesson of history's quietest moments, that even in the absence of what we expect, there is still something speaking. We only have to be still enough to hear it. Story 7. Famine, Flour and Fungus in a Norman Village. The First Loaf. In the summer of 944, In the village of Le Mesnil-Mager in Normandy, a baker named Etienne pulled a loaf of rye bread from his oven and noticed something strange. The crust was darker than usual, not just burnt, but blackened, with faint greenish spots on the underside. Still, he tapped it. It sounded hollow, as bread should. He sliced it open. The crumb was dense but edible. He shrugged and placed it on the stall. By nightfall, 4 families had bought similar loaves. 2 complained of stomach cramps. 1 boy saw strange lights in the sky and spoke nonsense for hours. No one connected it to the bread. Not yet. The rains. That year, the spring rains had lingered well into June. The rye fields dotted across the low hills, and the marshy edges of the Orne River had grown tall but damp. Mold had begun to creep along the stalks, but the villagers needed the grain. The winter before had been long. Flour stores were low. No one had the luxury of discarding even the ugliest harvest. So the rye was cut, bundled, and stored as usual. No one examined the kernels closely. They simply ground what they had, mixing it with what little wheat remained. And thus the loaves continued to darken. The illness. By mid-August, the complaints had grown. Burning in the stomach, strange dreams, twitching fingers, a constant buzzing in the ears. Old Mal, a midwife who rarely spoke, began screaming at night. She claimed her bed was filled with snakes. 2 boys collapsed in the lane after breakfast, their limbs jerking as though possessed. The priest, Father Loup, declared it a punishment from God and advised fasting. The baker, Etienne, noticed that the blackest loaves were always the ones that caused complaints. He began throwing them out. But it was already too late. The fire on the hill. On the feast of St. Bartholomew, a fire broke out in a storage barn filled with rye flour. The flames leapt high, illuminating the hills and casting shadows over the village. No one tried to stop it. People stood silently, watching the sparks swirl into the night. It was not just fear of spreading flame, it was something deeper, a kind of grim satisfaction, as if the barn had deserved to burn. Later, some claimed to have seen faces in the fire, grinning, grimacing. A word from the abbey. A messenger arrived from the abbey of St. Wandril, bearing word of a similar affliction in villages further east. He carried with him a sample of strange, dark bread and a warning. The monks believe it to be cursed grain tainted by foulness in the field, not the devil, but something close. They called it Le Feu de Saint Antoine, St. Anthony's fire. The afflicted burned from within. Some saw visions, some lost fingers or toes. The monks advised burning any blackened flour and avoiding rye until winter. But in Le Mesnil-Mager, there was no other grain. Hunger and denial. The poorest families could not afford wheat flour. They had no livestock to trade, no access to distant mills. Rye was all they had. Even as rumor spread, mothers continued baking. Children chewed slowly. Elders ate in silence. They told themselves, "Ours is not the same. The mold is only on the crust. It hasn't happened to me yet." And the loaves kept appearing, grayer each week, then bluish, then nearly black. One man joked, "The bread so dark now, it might as well say Mass." No one laughed. The night of teeth. One cold September night, a girl named Aveline woke screaming. Her mother rushed to her side and found her clutching her face, weeping. She said the bread had grown teeth and bitten her while she slept. She had no bite marks. The villagers dismissed it as a dream. But the next day, the girl refused all food. She starved over 3 weeks, hallucinating spiders in her bowl and worms in every crust. When she died, the priest refused to bury her in consecrated ground. "Madness is not of God," he said. A grain inspector arrives. In late September, a monk named Brother Thierry arrived from Rouen. Thin, bespectacled, and quiet, He carried with him a book, a knife, and a cloth bag of specimens. He spoke little, but he visited every farm, every oven, every granary. He collected kernels, sliced open loaves, and muttered under his breath. Finally, he addressed the villagers. "You have ergot," he said, "a fungus that grows on rye. It mimics grain but poisons the body. It causes burning, convulsions, madness." He showed them a blackened kernel curved like a claw, hard as bone. The people stared horrified. One woman asked, "Is it the devil?" The monk replied, "It is natural, and that is what makes it more dangerous." The ban. At the monk's urging, the priest declared a ban on all rye. He instructed villagers to burn their stores and fast until clean wheat could be sourced. Many obeyed. Some wept as they watched their flour go up in smoke. Others hid sacks beneath floorboards. There were too many mouths, too many winters behind them, too much hunger to risk going without. And still the black bread appeared at some tables, quietly, desperately. Because the line between starvation and poison was thin and often blurred in the dark. Unresolved thought. The people of Lemesnil-Mauger had not been cursed. They had been hungry, and hunger makes choices that piety cannot undo. But when food turns against you, what do you feed your body or your fear? When dreams became teeth. By October of 944, the people of Lemesnil-Mauger were dreaming in color, but not the peaceful hues of harvest or hearth. Their dreams were blood red, bile yellow, ash black. They dreamed of bread that screamed when torn, fields that whispered their names, loaves that pulsed like hearts. Children woke crying. Adults sat up, gasping, sheets soaked with sweat. Midwives began carrying lavender in their pockets, hoping the scent might calm the dreams. It didn't. The affliction spread not like fire, but like mildew, quietly, persistently, never quite gone. Those who refused. A few families, out of fear or pride, refused to burn their rye stores. "I've eaten it for 60 years, said one elder. "I won't stop now." But by All Saints' Day, that man had been found wandering the pasture, muttering that the cows had stolen his eyes. His wife kept him tied to a chair for his own safety. Another family, 3 brothers who lived near the edge of the village, continued baking dark loaves and trading them for eggs. When one child collapsed after eating their bread, a neighbor accused them of witchcraft. That night their house was pelted with stones. No one admitted to it, but the message was clear. The community had turned against its own. The second fire. On a misty evening in mid-November, a second fire broke out, this time, not in a granary, but in a home. It was the house of a widow known for keeping to herself, who had refused to share her flour or accept the new white bread brought in by the monks. No one could say how the fire started. It consumed the cottage quickly. The widow's body was never found. Afterward, the villagers said little, but their silence was dense, heavy like dough that would not rise. The bread market closes. For generations, the village square had hosted a weekly bread market. Bakers from neighboring hamlets came with round loaves, braided rolls, crusty batards. Now the stalls were empty. No one trusted the bread. Even the wheat bread, pale and clean, was viewed with suspicion. Who could say what sack it had come from? What wind had passed through the field where it grew? One farmer put it plainly: better to eat nothing than chew madness. So they turned to broth, to boiled roots, to salt-soaked oats. The bread had broken its promise. A new prayer. In the church of St. Hadlin, Father Loop introduced a new line into the morning prayer: "Deliver us from the black grain, and keep our hands clean of false hunger." It was spoken slowly, reverently, and with eyes lowered. Some took to crossing themselves before meals, not just for grace, but as protection against what might lie beneath the crust. Bread had become not a gift, but a gamble. The returning stranger. In late November, Brother Thierry returned, this time bringing vials of herbal tincture and a small wax-sealed chest. He had come with 2 novices from the abbey, pale, tired men who had seen the same symptoms elsewhere. They had come to observe, not to heal. Thierry spoke with the sick. He touched the tongues of the delirious, took notes on parchment, and asked the afflicted what they saw. The answers were always strange. "I see ants with human hands. The sky is growing mold. My mother's voice is in the crust." He listened without judgment. The monk's warning. Brother Thierry addressed the villagers in the square under a gray, damp sky. His tone was calm but firm. "This is not magic. It is nature's revenge for damp grain and hasty mills. Ergot feeds on wet rye. It poisons your blood, your eyes, your soul. It is not sent by demons, but if you ignore it, it will turn you into one." Then he opened the wax-sealed chest and revealed a loaf preserved, dark as soot, dotted with pale filaments. He broke it open to show the twisted purple kernels. People recoiled. One woman fainted. Thierry did not speak again. He let the image settle. Rituals of protection. Superstition filled the vacuum left by hunger and fear. Red thread was tied to oven doors to ward off the grain's ghost. Bakers began marking loaves with crosses not for religion, but protection. Some buried small stones in their flour sacks, claiming it kept the fungus away. A group of women walked the field paths at dusk, chanting old pagan songs about grain spirits. Even the priest, once a stern denouncer of folk practices, remained silent. There were no miracles to offer, only survival. The madman's map. One afflicted man, Elaine, a former field hand, tore apart his bed and used the straw to draw a strange pattern on his cottage floor. It resembled the shape of a fungal spore. No one knew how he had seen such a thing. When Brother Thierry visited, he examined the pattern silently, then wiped it away with his sleeve. But that night the monk was seen outside, looking at the stars, repeating the shape with his fingers in the air. The black loaf in the river. On the last day of November, a young girl was seen throwing something into the Orne River. When asked, she said it was the last black loaf. She had wrapped it in cloth, sewn it shut, and whispered to it before letting the current take it. Some villagers took this as a sign. They began burning the remaining rye sacks. Others buried theirs at the forest's edge. One family held a bread funeral, lowering loaves into a small pit with prayers and tears. The villagers were exorcising their food. Unresolved thought. How do you rebuild trust in something so simple, so sacred as bread, once it has betrayed you? When food becomes fear and nourishment sows madness, can the table ever feel safe again? The first white crumb. In early December of 944, for the first time in months, a child bit into a loaf of pale wheat bread and smiled. The baker, Etienne, had received a small sack of wheat flour from his cousin near Caen, a village untouched by the strange rye plague. He baked it carefully, whispering the prayers his mother had taught him. He set the loaf on the windowsill. No one approached it for hours. Eventually, a boy no more than 6 tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed. He had never known a time without dark, bitter bread. She gave him a slice. He chewed it slowly, then nodded. It tasted like nothing, like peace, like air. It did not bite back. A communal choice. Word spread. Those who had buried their flour began unearthing it, not to use, but to burn it properly. Brother Thierry guided a ritual at the edge of the village, where the Orne bent like a sleeping dog. They built a pyre of moldy bread, rye stalks, and blackened flour sacks. One woman added her baking stone, another her apron. As the fire caught, Thierry led a prayer not to saints but to memory. Let us remember what fed us, let us remember what hurt us, and let us never confuse the two. The villagers stood in silence, their mouths empty but full of meaning. The new bread law. In the wake of the sickness, Father Loup and Thierry proposed a new law, carved into a wooden post in the village square. Rye shall not be milled after the month of June. Flour must be dried before storage. Bakers must examine kernels by candlelight. Any blackened loaf shall be burned without ceremony. No bread shall be sold without the mark of a clean cross. It was not enforced by sword or punishment, but by collective memory. The village knew what happened when rules were ignored. They could still hear the screams. The marked oven. Etienne the baker carved a cross into his oven door, not the religious sort, but a simple, equal-armed plus scratched deep into the stone. It was said that no black loaf ever emerged from his hearth again. People began marking their own ovens and even their doors with the same sign, not out of superstition but habit, a way of saying, "We remember." The mark became known as La Croix de la Maille, the Crumb's Cross. Even children traced it in the air before slicing a loaf. What the survivors remembered. Those who had eaten the worst of the bread, the ones who lived through the spasms, the visions, the madness, carried something in their eyes forever. Not guilt, not shame, but caution. They were the ones who sniffed grain before grinding, who checked the dew level before harvesting, who told children not to eat the crust if it smelled wrong. One of them, Usabao, whose brother had barked like a dog until he died, became a local herb woman. She refused to work with anything baked. She said bread had mouths. No one argued. The crumbless feast. For the next 3 winters, the villagers held a crumbless feast. It was a meal of boiled beans, onions, cider, and salted fish, everything but bread. They sat on the floor, they drank from clay cups, they ate slowly. At the end, someone would place an empty plate at the head of the table. No one touched it, no one explained it. It was the plate for the lost. Visitors and warnings. Travelers from other Norman villages began visiting Le Mesnil-Mauger to hear the story of the black bread. They came with questions. Was it real? Could it happen again? How did you survive? The villagers didn't answer directly. They simply pointed to the burned patch at the edge of town, or to the mark on their ovens, or to the small cross still carved into the bell tower. The message was clear. We didn't forget, neither should you. Thierry's departure. Brother Thierry stayed until spring, then left as quietly as he had come. He left behind his book, full of notes on symptoms and sketches of spore-covered kernels. Before he departed, he gave the book to a girl named Perrine, who had lost her father to the sickness but never stopped asking questions. Make sense of it, he told her. We must do more than survive, we must understand. Perrine would later be sent to the abbey herself. The villagers said she never ate rye again. After the fungus, by 946, Le Mesnil-Mauger had recovered on the surface. The fields were green again, planted now with more barley and wheat. The church bells rang. The bread market reopened tentatively, then steadily. But something remained beneath the crust of everyday life. Not fear, not even grief, but reverence. Bread had once been a miracle, then a poison. Now it was neither. It was earned. And in every loaf sliced, every crumb caught on a tongue, was the quiet memory of a time when survival meant choosing between hunger and hallucination. Final reflection. History remembers plagues, wars, kings, and crusades. But sometimes the things that shape us most deeply are simpler: a damp spring, a stubborn fungus, a loaf too dark to trust. The people of Le Mesnil-Mauger endured not because they understood, but because they adapted. They listened. They remembered. And through burned hands and bitter crusts, they learned the oldest lesson of all. What we put into our bodies becomes part of who we are, so we must choose, again and again, with care. Story 8. The Night the Stars Disappeared. A chronicle of medieval smoke and skis. The sky changed first. On a clear evening in the late summer of 1258, in the small English village of Hartley, the stars did not come out. It had been a dry, pleasant day. Fields of barley rippled golden in the wind. The last apples were beginning to turn. Children had played by the edge of the stream, and old men had lingered at the edge of the green to talk about planting winter turnips. But when dusk came, the sky remained a dull, lifeless gray. Not cloud, not fog. Just wrong. The confused calendar. In those days, few peasants knew the exact date. Most marked time by saints' days, planting seasons, and the moon. But the monks at nearby Waverley Abbey recorded their observations in careful Latin script, and Brother Oswin, who was fond of sky-watching, noted. On the feast of St. Augustine the firmament was as lead, no stars, no moon, a pale darkness from horizon to crown. The next night was the same, and the next. No moon, no stars, no clarity. It was as though the heavens had been smudged with soot. A village reaction. The people of Hartley were not ones for grand theories. When the stars disappeared, they did what they always did. Closed shutters, lit candles earlier, prayed a bit louder. But the unease grew. The night did not feel like night. It felt suspended, like time had paused. The animals were quiet. The dogs growled at the air. Even the owls fell silent. When a fox barked in the distance, it startled the entire village. Ash on the wash line. 3 days later, a woman named Alice went to retrieve her laundry from the line and found it coated in fine gray dust. She scolded her children, thinking they'd kicked soot from the hearth. But when she looked up, she saw the dust in the air falling like soft snow, too slow for rain. That evening the smell came. Not rot, not fire. Something sharper, like burned stone or wet wool left too long in smoke. By morning, every roof in the village bore a thin layer of ash. The monks began to wonder. At Waverley Abbey, Brother Oswin consulted the herbarium master, who confirmed that none of the local plants were burning. They checked nearby farms, no fires. They sent a rider to Guildford and heard the same. Dark skis, ashfall, no cause. The monks speculated. A sign of the end times. A celestial eclipse. Smoke from the Scottish border. Brother Oswin wrote hesitantly. Perhaps something burns beyond our ken. Bread and breath. Within a week, people began coughing. The ash was not heavy, but it was constant. It coated windowsills, clung to hair, settled in bowls. Bakers noticed the bread turned gray when left to rise overnight. Children rubbed their eyes raw. One cow refused to eat and died within days. The village healer, old Elric, claimed its lungs were like crumbled parchment. Still no one panicked. People endured, they always did. But the world had changed, and the reason remained invisible. A scribe's letter. A merchant passed through from Winchester and carried with him a letter copied from a distant priory in France. It read, "The sun is pale, the stars are hidden, fields wither before the frost. We fear the air has turned against us." The villagers listened quietly as the scribe read aloud. None spoke. The merchant left in the morning, coughing into a cloth. He did not return the way he came. The night of no silence. 10 days into the ashfall, the village experienced its first true darkness. No moon, no stars, no torches. The ash thickened, the air choked. A mist settled, brownish-gray and stinging. No one left their homes. Some reported strange dreams that night. One saw a sky raining coals. Another, a tree growing from his chest. A girl claimed the stars whispered from behind a curtain. Old Elric whispered, "We are walking in the shadows of a fire we did not see." The weather changes. Then came the cold. By the end of August, the air had turned brittle. Leaves began to fall before their time. Crops stopped growing. The barley heads drooped and remained green. Apples shriveled on the branch. Rain came blackened with soot. Fields turned muddy without cause. The harvest failed not all at once, but slowly, like a candle dying from lack of air. People did not say famine. That word came later. But they felt the absence in their bones. Unresolved thought. They had seen no fire, heard no thunder, yet the skies had gone dark, the stars had vanished, and something in the world had shifted. But if the fire wasn't near, where then was it burning? The smoke that came from nowhere. By early September of 1258, the people of southern England, like many across Europe, lived under a sunless sky. They called it many things. The soot drape, the gray veil, the sky's mourning. But there was no name for what caused it, only the observation that something had changed everywhere, yet started nowhere they could see. Birds flew lower. Bees failed to return to their hives. Even the cats, usually indifferent to omens, kept close to hearths. It was as if the sky itself had taken ill. A famine without fire. The crops withered in a way no one had seen before. It wasn't drought, the rains had come. It wasn't frost, the air was cold, yes, but not killing. Rather, it was as if the plants forgot how to grow. Barley halted halfway. Beans yellowed without swelling. Onions split open and went soft. Father Godric of the nearby village of Pewley wrote in his journal, "The plants emerge, then tremble, then stop, as though waiting for sun that never returns." By the time Michaelmas arrived, September 29, it was clear the harvest had failed. Hunger settles in. By October, the word famine was no longer whispered. It was spoken openly, like a storm coming over the hills. Prices for oats doubled. Bread shrank in size. The poor boiled bark and grass. In Hartley, Alice the laundress began selling pieces of her roof thatch as fuel. Children walked slower. Old men stayed in bed. The church bells rang less often, not out of reverence, but because there was nothing new to mark no weddings, few births, too many deaths. The false prophet. One afternoon, a man dressed in rags appeared on the edge of the village. He wore a crown of woven straw and carried a broken bell. He declared, "The stars have been taken as ransom for our sins. Repent, or the moon shall drown next." Some mocked him, others threw stones. A few quietly wondered if he might be right. The priest, Father Arnulf, had the man led out of town. But even as he disappeared down the road, the people noted the silence of the birds, the stillness of the air. And they wondered, what if the man had only said it poorly but was still right? Reports from afar. In late autumn, more merchants passed through hungry themselves, their mules thin and tired. They brought stories from Ireland, where sheep had died en masse; France, where rivers ran thick with mud; Germany, where snow had fallen in August. One had heard of a strange, sunless summer across the Byzantine Empire. Another claimed Venetian sailors spoke of an ash storm on the Indian Ocean. None could confirm the cause. All agreed on the effect. The world has dimmed. The dust in the skin. Physicians, those who could still afford paper, recorded new ailments. Eyes that refused to focus. Nails that turned black. Skin that itched and peeled. In Hartley, women scrubbed themselves raw, thinking they were coated in invisible soot. A boy began scratching in his sleep. When he woke, there were fine lines drawn into his arms like the veins of leaves. People blamed the ash. The monks called it miasma. The midwives simply said, "The sky has changed our breath." The silent Christmas. That winter's Yuletide feast was not. There was no pig to roast, no beer to brew, no sweetened bread. Instead, families sat together in silence and chewed hardened oatcakes. Children cried quietly. Stories were told, but only the old ones, the ones before the sky turned gray. Someone tried to sing a carol, her voice broke. In some houses, people left out a bowl of clean water not for saints, but for the stars, should they return and need a place to rest. The Scholar's Letter. A monk from Oxford, Brother Edwin, passed through Hartley on his way south. He brought no grain, but shared his theory. It was a volcano, somewhere far, perhaps in the east. The smoke rose high beyond even birds and spread across the world. It changed the sky, cooled the air, and veiled the sun. The villagers nodded, but didn't understand. If a fire had caused all this, why had no one seen it? Still, they appreciated the clarity. Even an invisible answer was better than no answer at all. The stars return. On the 19th of March, 1259, a shepherd's boy named Corbin looked up while tending his sheep and saw Orion. Only 3 stars, dim and pulsing, but there they were. He shouted until his voice cracked. By the next week, more stars appeared. The moon grew brighter, the ash fell less often, the air felt softer. Spring came slow, the barley did not race to grow, but it tried. The worst had passed. Unresolved thought. No one in Hartley ever found the source of the ash, but its memory remained in the way they looked at the sky, in the prayers they whispered not just to God, but to the stars themselves. If the heavens can go dark without warning, what else waits above us, out of sight, out of reach? The year after, in the spring of 1259, life in Hartley began to move again, not quickly, not joyfully, but with a cautious rhythm. The sun returned, but it was pale. The birds came back, though fewer than before. The barley pushed through the soil like a creature waking from a long and troubled sleep. People watched the sky more often. They no longer took its brightness for granted. A cloudy afternoon could send ripples of worry through the village. Candles were kept close. Ash was checked for on windowsills, even when there was none. A boy in the village said it best. It's like the sky got sick, and we're still waiting to see if it's better. What was lost? Not everyone survived. In Hartley alone, 7 elders died of hunger or sickness. 2 infants were lost before their nomming days. 1 girl vanished in the woods on a foggy morning and was never found. No mass graves, no plague carts, just a slow fatting like candles going out one by one. There were no memorials, but people remembered. The child who scratched stars into his arms. The old man who stopped talking when the sky turned gray. The woman who sang to a bowl of water, hoping the stars would drink from it. A new way of looking. By summer, the villagers had made small but lasting changes. Fields were planted with more variety: barley, oats, root vegetables. Food stores were buried deeper, in case of another sky darkening. Calendars were carved not just with saints' days, but symbols for stars, moons, and sun sightings. A new habit emerged. Before any meal, someone, often the youngest at the table, would say aloud, "The stars have returned, let us eat in their light." It was not doctrine, it was memory. The legend that took hold. Within a decade, the story of the starless year became legend. Children asked their grandparents if it was true that the moon had turned its face away, that the sun had nearly died. Some said the stars had fled because of human sin. Others claimed they had been kidnapped by spirits jealous of Earth's fire. One tale said that a dragon in the east had breathed smoke into the sky and had to be calmed with a river of gold. All were wrong. All were attempts to make sense of the unseen. But even wrong stories carry weight. A monk's final note. Brother Oswin, the monk who had first recorded the lead sky, lived to old age. In his final entry, written with a shaking hand, he wrote, "The sky has forgiven us or forgotten us. Either way, the light has returned. I no longer fear the stars, but I respect their silence." He died quietly in his abbey cell. His journal, smudged with soot in its early pages, became one of the few surviving documents of the 1258-1259 atmospheric anomaly. It would be rediscovered centuries later. Modern reflections. Today we know what caused it. In 1257, 1 year before the darkness, a volcano in present-day Indonesia, Mount Samalas on Lombok Island, erupted with a force that dwarfed nearly every eruption in recorded history. It sent ash and sulfur into the stratosphere, creating a global veil that dimmed sunlight for over a year. The peasants of Hartley never knew its name. They never saw a map. They had no concept of stratospheric aerosols. But they lived its consequence. And they responded with bread shared despite famine, songs whispered to the sky, a stubborn refusal to forget, the ash in the walls. Centuries later, when restorers cleaned the beams of St. Cuthbert's Church in Hartley, they found a thin layer of ancient soot embedded in the roof joints consistent with volcanic ash. It was analyzed, dated, confirmed. They also found, scratched into the stone near the altar, a simple etching. A dark moon, a lone star, a single candle. A child's hand had carved it, likely around 1260. It was not Latin, not prayer. Just a reminder. Final reflection. The stars in their silence taught a village humility. The sun's absence reminded them that even the most constant things can vanish. The ash in their lungs, though unseen, lingered long after the skies cleared. We measure time in great wars, in kings and conquests, but sometimes history is shaped by quiet things, by dust, by light, by the way people hold their breath when the stars fail to appear. And still, we look up hoping never to lose them again.